83 Where to go? Harel nodded carefully. If you say so I'll trust you, she said with determination. Neliel nodded slowly. I can remember everything now that you've healed me, Hisashi. I used to be a high-ranking member in Los Noches. The third-ranked espada under Aizen's rule. He has never done anything wrong, but he has always given me a slightly off feeling. I just dismissed it as it just being me, but you seem to feel even stronger about it, so maybe it wasn't just me, she admitted. Hisashi smiled and patted her on the head subconsciously due to being so used to doing that to Nell too. Surprisingly, Neliel didn't reject it though and smiled happily at the attention. He inwardly sighed. They would need to figure out their relationship at some point now that she had regained her memories. She was probably old enough to be his many times over great-grandmother, so he couldn't keep treating her like she was his innocent little foul-mouthed sister. Even if she didn't seem to be fighting it so far, it just felt strange between her now very adult form and more adult personality. As for joining him, we don't have much of a choice. If I'm wrong and he is completely nice and trustworthy as he portrays himself, then joining him would be the right choice. If however I'm right and he isn't the way he portrays himself, then by refusing we are making him an enemy. One with an army of Arrancar more powerful than that one you were already struggling with, he said. Harel and the Trebuchets looked saddened. They had thought they were amongst the top of the hierarchy in Wo Mundo, only to be instantly disavowed of that belief after one fight. They realized there were still many more powerful than them. Powerful enough that even with all of them sticking together they might not be powerful enough to stand up to them, and it made them feel insecure. Then what are we supposed to do? Apache asked in frustration. We were able to beat that Arrancar, who says we can't beat the others in Los Noches? Mila Rose stated stubbornly. Hisashi shook his head with a sigh. Was that Arrancar powerful before he became an Arrancar? He asked. They all shook their heads. No, Harel could easily thrash him before. He was one of the weaklings under Barragan, Mila Rose said proudly as if it had been her own achievement. Hisashi nodded. So if one of their weaklings grew powerful enough to handle not only Harel but all four of you as Vasto Lord, what do you think happened to the more powerful members that went through the same process to become Arrancar? He asked them. That silenced them. That could be really bad, Apache ventured carefully. Worse yet, how powerful do you think Barragan would be if he has also become an Arrancar? He continued. Harel sighed. That would be very bad, she confirmed. Mila Rose looked disappointed, but it seems she finally understood the stakes. You can't just punch everything to fix your problems. At least not unless you are the stronger party. Exactly, so really our only option is to at least act like we are joining them. We will have to make sure we stick together after joining them. We will use them to become more powerful first. We can worry about dealing with them after that, he said. Neliel stepped up. As long as at least one or more of us are espada, we can have our own faction. Pest, Dondakaka, Buwabawa and I were together before joining Los Noches. Once I became an espada, they were able to join my faction and we were free to manage our own business as long as we followed the few orders Aizen did issue. She explained. She looked over all those present. Unless a lot has changed in the months I have been away from Los Noches, this shouldn't be a problem since I should be powerful enough to take up the position of espada again, so we could do that and you could be my frackie, and even without becoming an Arrancar, Hisashi might be powerful enough to become one too, if so we could also join under him. Finally, if you risk it and do become Arrancar, since you become Vasto Lord before becoming Arrancar, all of you would probably become powerful enough to qualify as espada afterwards, she offered. Hisashi smiled at her. Exactly, we just need to stick together, he said. She hugged him excitedly again, just happy he agreed with her. As long as we can stay together, she said. Harel looked troubled. He couldn't tell if it was about joining Los Noches and what Neliel said, or if she was still dealing with Neliel's sudden transformation. The Trebuchets looked at Harel. Though things had shifted as they got to know each other, Harel was still one of the main decision makers amongst their group. What do you think? Sung Sun asked her. Apache and Mila Rose nodded along, also curious to hear what she had to say. Harel looked back and forth between Neliel, Hisashi and the Trebuchets. If Hisashi is right, we probably don't have much of a choice, and if we can stay together like Neliel said, that's what is most important to me, she said. Hisashi looked at the Trebuchets. Then what do the three of you think? He asked. We'll follow what Harel and you decide, Sung Sun said. That's right. Apache said as if it was something to be proud of. Mila Rose simply nodded in agreement. He glanced over at Nelliel's Frakian. Pest straightened his back. We follow Nelliel-sama, he said. We do, don't you know, Don Takaka said in agreement. Well, not like he hadn't expected that. He looked over at Nelliel with a smile. She smiled. I'll go wherever you go, she said before blushing when she realized what she had said. 84 new digs. Hisashi nodded thoughtfully. I guess that decides things then. We will join Los Noches, but stick together and be prepared to defect if necessary. He confirmed. They all nodded in agreement. They spent a few days going over their plans together and preparing for the move to Los Noches. At least there wasn't that much to given that until recently almost none of them had been humanoid nor had any possessions of their own to take with them, which sped up packing a lot. The more important thing they did was to perform some further testing and exercises to make sure both Sung-sun and Nelliel were in top shape. Though things would probably go just fine when they joined the Arrancar, it was best to be safe rather than sorry. After all, plenty of the Arrancar wouldn't be that friendly. First and foremost Grimmjow, who should also be there currently. They decided to take the more leisurely way to travel there by using Buwabawa as a form of transport. He didn't even mind everyone riding on him, was just happy to be of use to them for once. He couldn't really help much with actual combat, just being a regular hollow unlike the rest, but at least he could be of use in them this way by providing them with comfortable travel. Since she could no longer hang from nor sit on his shoulders, Nelliel instead decided to use his lap or sometimes even body as a pillow instead while they traveled. He wasn't sure why, considering most of his body was pretty hard and not that comfortable, with only the parts where his skin was exposed being soft to the touch. The rest felt closer to some kind of armor. Whenever they ran into hollows on the way, since everyone had become a Vasto Lord, Hisashi just eliminated them quickly by himself so he could gain the experience and absorb their spirit power. Harel still wasn't thrilled, but after experiencing the threat of the Arrancar, she just accepted that he had to do that to grow. Her only expectation was that he couldn't attack any hollows that didn't attack them first. Hisashi decided it was a fair enough compromise if it kept Harel from becoming mad with him, so he readily agreed. Despite Buwabawa's speed, it still took a couple of weeks to make it to Los Noches. Harel had made sure their hideout was far from Baragan's after the last encounter they had had with him, and Wo Mundo was a very large place. Finally, when they passed over one of the countless white dunes they had passed, they saw a giant structure in the distance. A huge building tall enough to house skyscrapers and large enough to fit an entire city, topped with a dome. It was surrounded by similarly tall towers that flared at the base, equally spaced around its circumference. All of it was constructed of the same even white material, as if every nook and cranny had been meticulously stuccoed until every surface was smooth white, giving it a cold, clinical look. It stood out among the near endless nothingness that the white desert surface of Wo Mundo presented. Due to how massive the structure was, despite being able to see it, it still took them a while to reach the entrance. He decided to review his status before entering the Den of Vipers that was Los Noches. Notification summary. Mission completed, Heal Nelliel 2 Odelstwank. Active skill, Kurin-Zanjutsu gained. Kurin-Zanjutsu. An ancient sword technique that combines swordsmanship and the control of the black flames of bloodlust, which, unlike regular fire, can turn physical. The flames can be used for offensive techniques, either for their destructive properties or to reinforce the user's weapon. Common forms used for the flames outside of enhancing one's attacks are chains to bind or a shield to protect. Plus 4,556,370 XP from HALLOW. Plus 223,300 spirit power from HALLOW. Plus 205,436 spirit power from spiritual energy absorption. Plus 12 levels. Plus 12 stat points. Status panel. Name, Saito Hisashi. Soul age, 58/59. Race, HALLOW. Rank, Vasto Lord. Level, 260/272. XP, 8,310/371,280. Stats. Strength, 325. Dexterity, 656. Constitution, 175. Intelligence, 250. Spirit power, 3,906,413/4,335,149. Available stat points, 0/12. Passive skills. Spiritual energy absorption. Ultra speed regeneration. Acidic touch. Silencioso. Active skills. soul-body separation, spirit power concealment, illusory aura, blute, energy blade, transcribe, Hachijio Sogai, Sero, Kumin, negation, skill infusion, Sonido, Korinzanjutsu. Korinzanjutsu had been his reward for healing Neliel. He hadn't been entirely sure about it, but it was actually a rather useful technique for him considering he was a swordsman and used multiple swords. It would not only enhance his swordsmanship itself, but also extend his range of abilities he could use during fights. He could use it as a form of crowd control and also to protect himself, both of which were more than worth it. It wasn't like he wouldn't have wanted to heal her anyway. Even if the system was kind enough to give him the full knowledge of all techniques using the Korinzanjutsu ability, just like with the other abilities granted by the system, it would still take quite some practice and real combat experience to fully integrate it with his combat style. Until he did, he wouldn't be able to bring out the full potential of the abilities. At least switching back to being the only one consuming hollows had helped maintain some growth even against the ever-slowing leveling up. He wasn't sure if there was a level cap, but even if there wasn't, at a certain point it was bound to crawl to a halt simply due to the world eventually being unable to produce enough spiritual beings to consume to continue growing. It was already taking him weeks to gain a single level. Soon enough he knew it would be months and eventually decades might pass without a single level up. 85 Cold reception. He didn't really want to think of the possibility of centuries. Unlike Shinigami, it never was really clarified about hollow whether they aged and died, though it seemed unlikely as long as a hollow continued to consume spirits. They could starve and degrade back to mindless hollow, however the only way towards death seemed to be for a Quincy to obliterate their soul or a Shinigami to purify it. Part of him realized this meant eventually everyone he knew while alive would pass. Even if they become spirits, that was still a temporary state where eventually their soul would be bleached and they reincarnated as a blank slate. The only ones that might be able to stick with him in the long run were other hollow like Harel, the Trebuchets, Neliel, and Neliel's Frakian. That is if they didn't die of unnatural causes, of course. Wo Mundo wasn't a safe place for hollow, and Earth and Soul Society even less so. Plenty of possibilities for death. The only thing he could do was to continue helping them grow as he had done by turning them into Vasto Lord before they even became Arrancar. This should massively improve their chances for survival. He was kind of stuck what else he could do for them. Once they became Arrancar, he had no real clue how to help them grow further. Just one of the many things he needed to figure out at some point. For now he needed to worry about how they were going to survive joining Los Noches and him possibly stealing the Hogyoku from Aizen, which were already more than enough to keep him occupied. He sighed. Just put 10 points into intelligence and the what's left over to dexterity, he ordered the system. Dexterity, 656/658. Intelligence, 250/260. Available stat points, 12/0. When they finally made it to the structure, the Trebuchets looked up at the walls of Los Noches with some trepidation. Hisashi gave them an awkward smile. "We're going to be okay," he tried to comfort them. He wasn't even entirely sure himself though, since usually he went into situations knowing he was completely able to deal with any challenge that may come his way. This time was different though. Even if he became an Arrancar, he wasn't sure he would be able to handle all of Los Noches and Aizen, let alone now while most of them were all still regular hollow. They were greeted by 2 Arrancar at the gates. A slender teenage-looking female Arrancar sporting long, black hair tied into 2 pigtails. Only one of her pink eyes are visible because the other is covered by her hollow mask and bangs. She was wearing a short, frilly skirt. A sleeveless top that left most of her front including her cleavage uncovered with the exception of 2 pieces that wrapped around her side to cover just past her nipples. She wore white bracers that covered her forearms. It was lowly Avern. Hisashi thought she was quite cute, and if it weren't for him knowing about her rotten personality, he would have been more than happy for a chance to get to know her better. The other was also a teenage-looking female Arrancar, but rather than feminine, this one looked like a tomboy. She had short, slicked back blonde hair with a fringe that covered her right eye, which was also covered by her hollow mask, unlike her left, which was green. She wore a short-sleeved white top with an upturned collar that was zipped down far enough to reveal her cleavage. The top left her thighs exposed. A black sash held up her white hakama. This was Menali Malia. Unlike Loli, her personality at least was much better, though she was kind of a pushover, so she couldn't really be trusted. The two were like a mirror reflection to each other. Inverted. One had a mask over her right eye, the other the left. One had light blonde hair, while the other's was pure black. One was more feminine while the other more masculine. They looked quite aloof as if they didn't care about their arrival. Loli first noticed Dondakaka's large frame. What are those loos minus she started, but stopped herself the moment she saw Neliel, who was back to her full power adult form. Neither Loli nor Meneli could stand up against Neliel even if they attacked her together. She looked a little nervous. Even if Neliel was one of the most aloof Arrancar, that still didn't mean they felt safe if they insulted her Frakian. Even if the two of them were practically Aizen's aides in Los Noches, Arrancar didn't tend to respect political power, only personal power. This meant they were quite used to having to gritting their teeth and putting up with others, since their personal power was rather lacking amongst the members of Los Noches. When Hisashi's group got closer, she gulped. Even if most of them weren't Arrancar, being faced with 5 Vasto Lord was still very unusual. The vast majority of Arrancar in Los Noches had been Ajuches before transforming. The amount that succeeded in becoming Vasto Lord could be counted on one hand, at least before now. She was now meeting a group of 5 of them at once. Even if they weren't strong enough to handle the strongest of Los Noches, at least not before becoming Arrancar, they were still formidable and had reached this level of strength all on their own, unlike almost anyone else there. Hisashi stood at the front, towering over the 2 petite girls. Loli looked him up and down. Besides the 4-bladed arms, he looked surprisingly human. She wasn't sure why, but despite not giving off a dangerous amount of spirit pressure, he felt dangerous. It was like the feeling of being stalked by a predator you couldn't see. Quite unsettling. More so than most hollow she met and even the others in her group. Aizen-sama has been expecting you, she said nervously. He could see some anger in her eyes though. Unsurprising with how much she hated having to be subservient to anyone but Aizen. She hated the feeling of being inferior to others or having to bow to others. The only one she should be below is Aizen. At least mentally seemed mostly relaxed, though still slightly wary with all the newcomers. 86 Meeting the Espada. Hisashi smiled. Thanks for the warm welcome, he said, every so slightly sarcastic. Apaxi chuckled, causing Loli to blush from a combination of embarrassment and irritation. It seems they hadn't missed what she was about to say first, even if she caught herself halfway. Follow me, she managed to get out through gritted teeth. Meneli smiled at first, but when Loli sent her a glare that quickly disappeared. Hisashi followed them and the rest of his group followed suit behind him. They were led through a bunch of hallways, chambers, open spaces for quite some time. It looked like getting lost here was exceptionally easy, since except for a few open spaces so much looked alike, since everything seemed to be made up out of the same white material and geometric shapes. Most hallways and rooms couldn't be told apart from one another. Eventually they were led into a room with a long white table surrounded by chairs with tall backs. On each chair was an Arrancar. A short, slender, somewhat androgynous male Arrancar. His skin was as pale as bone and shaggy black hair down to his neck. His eyes were a vibrant green with cat-like slit pupils. He had on black mascara with 2 black lines descending from his lower eyelids to his jaw and black lipstick on his upper lip. He was wearing white hakama and a fitted white jacket with long coattails and a tall collar. His hollow mask covered the left side of his head, but left his face uncovered. Ulquira cipher. An Arrancar that looked like a short, stocky elderly man with short, slicked back gray hair and a thick mustache. His right eye was shut due to a thick scar running across it. His hollow mask framed his face like a white crown. He was wearing a white hakama, a white short-sleeved coat lined with black fur, a pair of black fur-lined golden bracers and golden ropes around his waist tied with a round golden buckle with a sun engraved on it. Baragan Lusenbairn. A tall male Arrancar with parted shaggy shoulder-length brown hair and a faded goatee. All that was left of his hollow mask was a lower jaw lined with teeth hanging around his neck. He was wearing a white hakama, white coat with a lapel and popped collar. A black sash tied his zanpakuto to his waist. His jacket was left open enough to reveal the hollow hole in the center of his chest. Coyote Stark. A very tall and lanky male Arrancar with long sleek black hair down to his shoulders. A large white eye patch covered his left eye. He wore white hakama tucked inside his black boots with curled toes like a jester. A white coat with a tall popped collar that didn't cover his upper chest. He wore 3 silver bangles on each wrist. And Neutra Gilga. A tall, muscular, dark-skinned, bald male Arrancar. The only thing left of his mask were a row of bony spikes running along the crest of his head like a mohawk and a necklace of white teeth like pieces of bone around his neck. He wore white hakama and a long-sleeved form-fitting white jacket with black accents. Samurai Laru. A tall thin male Arrancar with shoulder-length pink hair with bangs covering the right side of his face. His mask had turned into a pair of glasses. He wore a white form-fitting jacket with a turtle neck and white hakama, both of which had black accents. Ciela Parograns. Another appeared to be male, but since his head was concealed with a tall cylindrical white mask that completely concealed his head with 8 holes in it, the only indication was the body shape. He wore a long frilly white black-lined coat with a tall, upright wavy collar over what seemed to be a long white dress that came down to his ankles as if he were some kind of frivolous young master. Aroniro Aruri. Then there was the only female espada in the room. She had short wavy purple hair done up in 2 short twin tails with a fringe falling over the right side of her face. All that was left of her mask looked like a white spiky hairpin pinning back the left side of her hair, keeping it out of her face. She had a purple teardrop on each of her cheeks below her eyes. Her fingernails were painted black and she had painted her lips purple. She wore a small frilly short-sleeved white dress with large puffy shoulders that emphasized her breasts, fingerless evening-style gloves, black knee-high boots and leg warmers up to her thighs that attached to garters. Her look evoked a gothic Lolita impression despite its mostly white appearance. On her back were 2 white wing-shaped things. He wasn't sure if they were real wings or just part of her flamboyant outfit. Suruxi Sanderwixi. A tall muscular male Arrancar with short spiky black hair and blue eyes. He had a prominent Van Dyke-style beard and mustache. All that was left of his mask looked like a forehead protector with 2 small horns on it. He wore a white form-fitting jacket with fringes along the forearm of the sleeves with a tall popped collar, white pants with tattered hems, and a red sash tied around his waist. Dordini Alessandro del Socaccio. The last one was another male Arrancar with a large, burnt orange afro, mutton chops, and a goatee. The only remains of his hollow mask was a skiing-style sunglasses-like shape on his forehead with a blue star in the middle. He wore a tight white pants and coat that had large frills along the collar and thighs. Gantenbane Mosqueda. At the head of the table Aizen was seated. He smiled at Loli and Memoli warmly, which caused them to blush. "Thank you for guiding them here for me," he said. 87 First impressions. Given that there were already 10 other Arrancar besides Aizen, those were probably the espada. Since Grimmjow wasn't among them, it seemed he had not yet managed to become one of the espada yet. Some of the Privaron espada from the series were also still espada. Most of them looked at them with some curiosity, but as espada they weren't too bothered. They felt the newcomers might be impressive outside of Los Noches, but within Los Noches walls they felt there were plenty of others on their level. The one that stood out most was Noitra, who was staring at Neliel with a look that could kill. After he finally felt he had gotten the upper hand over her and dumped her disgraced ass outside of Los Noches, here she was once again as if all he did was for nothing. Neliel just returned his glare neutrally as she always had. Aizen smiled, spreading his hands theatrically. "Welcome to Los Noches, so what have you decided on?" he said. He saw she stepped forward ahead of the others, smiling back at Aizen. "We would like to join," he responded for their group. Aizen nodded and clapped his hands once with satisfaction. "Excellent. I'm so glad to hear that. Welcome to Los Noches," he said. Dordini stood up with a wide smile. "Welcome," he bellowed excitedly. Gantenbane nodded in agreement, but most of the other Arrancar paid them no heed. The only other exception was Suruxi. "Finally some more women, it was getting so boring with all these guys," she said, completely ignoring Loli and Menoli. She looked over at Neliel. "Also welcome back, Neliel," she said. Neliel gave her a polite nod. "Thank you, Suruxi," she said. He saw she expected she wouldn't be as excited about their arrival if she realized it meant soon she would likely lose her position as an espada. Neliel already was powerful enough to replace one of the espada. Once they became Arrancar, Harel definitely was powerful enough to replace another, since she had been espada numero 3 in the original timeline. Not to mention Apaxi, Sung Sun, and Mila Rose, each of which actually stood a good chance at becoming one now that they had become Vasto Lord before even joining. Lastly, there was of course himself. The only ones in the group with no potential to become one would be Neliel's Frakian, who had their masks completely removed to cripple them. Apaxi frowned at Suruxi. Sung Sun smiled. "So nice to meet you too," she said. He saw she could tell it wasn't one of her genuine smiles, though. Unlike Apaxi, Sung Sun tried to avoid making enemies when she could. Sure. Mila Rose said uncaringly. Tyr and Neliel didn't give any further reaction. Suruxi seemed she wanted to talk more with them. Hisashi looked over all those there again. They were effectively in the snake pit now. It's nice to meet you all too, he said. Suruxi snorted and looked away. It seemed he was less welcome than the girls were. He just ignored it though. Like Loli, he wasn't someone he was particularly looking forward to getting to know. Even if she was totally his type, that was purely physically. Like Loli, her personality was an entirely different matter. Are we still needed here? Ulquira asked emotionlessly. Aizen sighed, but shook his head. No, he said. Ulquira simply nodded and left without even speaking with them. Aroniro followed shortly after. And Noitro was still glaring at Neliel, who continued to ignore him. His knuckles white from being clenched so tightly. Cielaparo was giving them an intrigued look, but said nothing. Barragan was looking at Harel with some disgruntlement, however it was nothing like the way Noitro was towards Neliel. Hisashi knew this wasn't something to be concerned about since Barragan and Harel got along well enough in Los Noches despite their history in the original, so he doubted it would be different this time around. He was more concerned about what Noitra might try. We still need to talk about turning you into a Arrancar, but first let's get you settled in. Loli. Mentally. Please show our new members their quarters, he said. The two girls nodded obsequiously. Hisashi always found their behavior strange. Hollow might bow to the stronger party, but it was rare for them to do so willingly. Usually there was resistance and desire to overthrow. This went for ones like Grimmjow and Noitra. However, he didn't sense that from the two of them. The alternative was ones like Ulquira that didn't seem rebellious even when they kneeled, but just didn't have the motivation to overthrow those above them. We'd like shared quarters, Harel said, taking the lead. They had decided to at least for now have Harel act like she was the leader publicly, since that was the assumption Aizen had made given that she had been the leader of the Trebuchets. This would allow them to hide Hisashi's position a little from the rest of Los Noches and get the others to underestimate him some. The other option would have been Neliel, but though she was powerful and caring, she didn't make for a great leader. Loli raised her eyebrow, looking over their entire group. All of you? She asked. Harel nodded slightly. Yes, we have been sharing the same cave for so long, we've grown accustomed to living together, she said. Even the guys? Loli asked. Harel glanced over at Hisashi for a moment, then simply nodded. Hisashi couldn't help but smirk a little hearing her request for them to live together. Harel noticed and rolled her eyes, but didn't say anything. Okay, follow us, Loli said. I look forward to our cooperation, Aizen said, sporting his creepy fake smile. They all bowed before heading out after the two girls. Noitra hadn't stopped flaring until they left the room. Hisashi was convinced he would be looking for trouble soon enough. Thankfully he had healed Neliel, who was powerful enough to defeat him all by herself, let alone the rest of them being around. Noitra wasn't above taking advantage of their weaker members though, so everyone would need to be on their guard. 88 cats and birds. Neliel excitedly jumped beside Hisashi, hugging on to one of his arms as they headed out. The other Espada that knew Neliel from when she was the numero 3 Espada were surprised to see the usually calm and collected Neliel this way. Hisashi and the others followed Loli and Meneli's lead. They had walked down a few hallways when suddenly Suruxi caught up with them. Wait up! She yelled after them. They all turned in surprise. Loli looked annoyed to have been interrupted, but didn't say anything and just kept walking. Suruxi ignored the two leading them and Hisashi while skipping along with them. Good to see you again, Neliel, she tried again. Neliel simply nodded before focusing back on Hisashi. She seemed more interested in hugging on to Hisashi than dealing with this superficial girl. Suruxi sighed, but turned her attention to Harel and the Trebuchets instead, giving them her best smile. Hi, I'm Suruxi, she introduced herself to them. Harel also nodded unsurely. Suruxi sighed again. Another strong silent type? She said exasperatedly. She looked over at the Trebuchets. What about the three of you? She asked. Apaxi snorted. Sung Sun chuckled from behind her sleeve. Don't mind her. She takes some time to warm up to everyone, she said lightheartedly. Mila Rose smirked. How strong are you? She asked. Suruxi raised her eyebrow. Strong enough, she said. Hisashi looked at her curiously as she continued trying to strike up a conversation with the girls. He was wondering what had led her to reach out to them. After some thinking, the only guess he came up with was that she hoped that with a bunch of female hollow joining up she might convince them to join her Frakian. That would explain why she had no interest in himself and Neliel and her Frakian. She was probably well aware now that Neliel was back to her peak strength. She easily surpassed Suruxi and would likely soon be rejoining the Espada. She was just wasting her time though, since even if none of them became Espada they would still not be joining her and instead join under Neliel's Frakian. However, he was convinced all of them would be much more powerful than Suruxi once they became Arrancar. He was quite sure he was more powerful than Suruxi even as he was, but he would rather not reveal any of his trump cards if he had the option. The truth was she really should be more worried about how much longer would Suruxi get to remain as an Espada than being concerned about expanding her Frakian. Soon Neliel would likely retake her former position. If not her, either Harel or Hisashi himself would, since they all needed to stick together. Grimmjow would likely do so too once he gained full control of his newly gained powers. Then there was Yami, who didn't seem to be on the Espada yet, but was probably somewhere in Los Noches right now. Her concern should be how long she could last as one of the Espada, as she was one of the weakest amongst the current selection of Espada. The first to risk dropping out were her, Ordini and Gantenbane. He wasn't entirely sure how those three stacked up against each other, but he knew all three of them were already Privaron Espada at least by the time the Arrancar first showed up in Karakura. Hisashi chose not to interfere with her trying to ingratiate herself with the girls though, even if it was for the purposes of winning them over to her own team. Sure, her personality wasn't the best, but she hadn't been an Aizen loyalist the way Loli and Menali were. There was still the possibility of winning her over to their side, but he wouldn't be holding his breath for it. They came across Grimmjow leaning against a wall before they got to their new quarters. "What are you doing here?" Loli asked indignantly. "Shut it, shorty." Grimmjow growled out dismissively before his eyes settled back on Hisashi. Loli gritted her teeth before stomping up towards him. "You only just joined. Not only that, but you came back like a beaten dog not too long ago. Know your place," she sneered. How dare he dismiss her like that? She already had to put up with the disrespect of most of the Espada. She wasn't going to be putting up with it coming from members not even powerful enough to be an Espada. Grimmjow's gaze hardened as it returned to her. He didn't like being disrespected, and when it was someone he felt was below him he didn't accept it. Faster than Loli could respond he dashed for her, his hand shooting towards her eye with his fingers stretched like a blade. Before he could gouge out her eye though, Hisashi interfered, grabbing a hold of his hand that was now mere inches away from a terrified Loli's eyeball. He had already been faster than Grimmjow during their last meeting and had pumped most of his stat points gained since then into his speed. Since he was already standing quite close to her, interfering wasn't too hard. Loli audibly gulped, looking between Hisashi and Grimmjow, who were staring at each other, and Grimmjow's hand that was still shaking as he was trying to overpower Hisashi to finish his attack. "How dare you? Aizen will hear about this," she exclaimed. Grimmjow clicked his tongue, but did pull his claw from Hisashi's grip, then walked off. "This isn't over yet," he said, looking back over his shoulder, but he was looking at Hisashi instead of Loli. It was clear their meeting hadn't been an accident and he hadn't given up on his prey yet. He had already escaped him twice and it was getting on Grimmjow's nerves. Loli was glaring at his back until he turned the corner, leaving her sight. She breathed in deeply a few times before calming down. She looked over the group, her eye eventually settling on Hisashi before looking away from him. Thanks," she murmured, not used to expressing her gratitude. She had even been treating him badly. Worse yet, this Vasto Lord had been able to save her from Grimmjow's attack that she hadn't even been able to react to, which embarrassed her. 89 settling in. Suruxi sighed. "Just ignore him. He isn't the only one like that here. If he gives you any trouble you can come to me," she said, still trying to ingratiate the girls to her. Hisashi just shook his head. It had already been shown he could probably stand up against Grimmjow, and she should know Neliel definitely could stand up to Grimmjow, so why would Harel or the Trebuchets go to Suruxi for help in dealing with Grimmjow? Neliel quickly found her spot on his arm again now that the fight was over, as if nothing had happened in the first place. She wasn't worried, as she could interfere if she needed to. "Next time I will kick his ass myself," Apaxi said. Mila Rose smirked. "If I don't get to him first," she chimed in. Sung Sun chuckled. "Sure, I'll leave the troublesome stuff to you too," she said. Suruxi smiled. "I wouldn't underestimate him too much. He might be one of our newer members, but he is quite powerful among those below us Espada, she said. Apache snorted. Well, Jack didn't have any problems getting rid of him last time, she retorted. To avoid the remote chance that Aizen might have investigated the poor human that White killed and managed to remember its name, he had convinced the others to act like his name was Jack A. Boreas. Although it was a stretch for Aizen to remember an insignificant human that happened to stumble upon one of his operations around 2 decades ago, he wouldn't put it past him either, so he would prefer not to risk it by using his human name with anyone he didn't trust entirely in Los Noches. Suruxi raised her brow, realizing him stopping Grimmjow before hadn't been a fluke despite him only being a Vasto Lord. It seemed her goal was getting tougher, as she wasn't only competing with Neliel to get their respect, but it seemed this guy might be troublesome too. Loli and Meneli eventually led them to their new quarters. By the time they got there, Loli had regained her composure and her haughtiness seeped back into her behavior. It seemed even saving her once could only do so much with her innate personality. Loli opened the door to their quarters. You will be staying here for now until your positions in Los Noches are determined, she said. She didn't wait any further and just left without even saying goodbye. Meneli seemed unsure, but quickly ran after her to catch up. Apache ran into their new quarters, excited to explore. Neliel smiled, pulling Hisashi by the arm into their new home. Let's go explore, she said excitedly. Hisashi chuckled lightly. All right, he agreed. The others joined after them to explore their new home for the foreseeable future. Suruxi smiled. I'll let you all explore your new quarters. I look forward to seeing more of you, she said before also leaving them alone. Harel simply nodded and closed the door after her. Wait for me, Sung Sun said, slithering after them. There was a large main room along with some hallways that contained smaller rooms. Some things of note were the lack of a kitchen, and the bathrooms didn't contain toilets. It made sense though, since HALLOW didn't eat regular food nor had a need to go to the bathroom. Everything was practically empty though, so they would need to figure out what to do regarding decorating the place. It appeared to be a suite the size of a small mansion. It was a little strange from human perspective, since despite its size it wasn't a separate building. Instead it was part of Los Noches' greater structure. The unusually smooth white walls and tiled floors giving off a cold atmosphere rather than something one could consider a home. It was still preferable to the sandy desert that made up most of Wo Mundo or even their cave hideout. At least the suite seemed to be on an exterior wall. Or was it an interior wall, since it was all in the huge dome of Los Noches? Either way, there were windows and they let in some of the still cold moonlight. Since each espada had their own palace, they probably wouldn't be staying there all that long, since at least one of them was likely going to become an espada soon. They would need at least one of them to do so to facilitate them sticking together under an espada rather than joining someone else. It turned out things in Los Noches didn't move that much faster than they did in the rest of Wo Mundo, as they wouldn't be getting transformed into Arrancar right away. There were still tasks to be done and tests to participate in before they would be allowed to become Arrancar. After everyone got settled down, Hisashi was relaxing in his own room. They didn't need anything like sleep, but it was nice sometimes to simply relax and not think about anything. The bedroom door creaked open and Neliel's head poked from behind it. She quietly snuck onto the bed with him curling up against him like she had gotten used to during the time they spent together before getting to Los Noches. Since he had already gotten used to it, he didn't say anything about it and let her do as she pleased. They spent the first few days getting settled while the girls furnished and decorated their quarters, at least to the extent that was available in Wo Mundo. Hisashi only really got a say over the decoration of his own room. It seems even if they were hollow instead of human, that didn't mean they weren't women after all. One thing that was a little surprising was just how empty Los Noches seemed. Even if there were more Arrancar than shown in the show, Los Noches was absolutely huge, so it actually wasn't that hard to spend a day without running into anyone else. On top of that, most of the Arrancar weren't very sociable. The only one that had come to visit them at all had been Suruxi, who still seemed to be trying to win over the girls, though she was wary of Neliel. 90 down the rabbit hole. Raina arrived in front of a small rundown store on a bare plot in a back alley of Karakura town. It was a traditional-style 2-story Japanese building built out of wood and plaster walls with a black tiled roof. A big sign hung above the sliding wood door entrance that simply said Urahara shop. Due to its diminutive size, it looked more like a home than a shop if one ignored the sign. The building stood out from its surroundings not only due to its traditional style, but also because it was surrounded by much taller modern-looking flats, causing quite the contrast. A white compact Japanese truck was parked beside the building. The mostly gravel plot with some grass growing here and there indicating a lack of maintenance didn't help the shabby appearance it was giving off. Raina looked the place up and down. Did I really come to the right place? She wondered to herself in confusion. She hesitated. I wasn't expecting something quite so run down when Masaki invited me over. Should I call to make sure? She wondered. Before she could decide, one of the front doors slid open, revealing a cute little black-haired girl. Her hair was put up in 2 ponytails coming down to her shoulders. Her bangs were parted down the middle, but a single long tuft of hair seemed to have escaped this, hanging down the center of her face. She was wearing a white t-shirt that said Urahara Shop in red on it, a pink skirt with white circles on it, and a pair of sandals. The two stared at each other for a while in awkward silence, but the girl didn't seem to plan to say anything at all. Eventually Raina caved. Hi there. I was told to meet someone here. I think, she said awkwardly. The girl looked at her silently for a little longer. Hello, she eventually managed to get out in a shy whisper. This didn't help Raina all that much though, as it didn't answer any of her questions. Raina bit her lip. Okay. Well, is Masaki here? She asked, trying to keep it simple for the little girl. The girl nodded again, but still did nothing else. Raina nodded slowly. Then could I meet her? She asked unsurely. Suddenly a boy with short spiky red hair wearing the same t-shirt and blue sweatpants popped up from behind the girl with an annoyed look on his face. He grind both his knuckles on the sides of his head. Yuru, you idiot. Stop wasting time, he growls at her. That hurts, Jinta-kun. Yuru cried out in tears. Jinta continued grinding his knuckles on the sides of her head. Shut up. Maybe you will learn this time. He yelled back. He suddenly stopped when Raina jumped in and hit the top of his head. Ah, what the hell do you think you're doing? He cried out, holding on to his head. Raina stared at him with a menacing smile and cracked her fist. I would like to know what you think you're doing. You brat. She asked menacingly. Yuru quickly hid behind her back, holding on to her clothes nervously and trying to make herself as small as possible. Jinta glared at her with tears in the corners of his eyes for a while. Whatever. Come in, he finally said, begrudgingly guiding them into the store. Raina narrowed her eyes at him, but didn't say anything further about it. The store portion of the building took up only a small room lined with waist-height wooden shelves stocking a large variety of strange products. Sitting in the back on an elevated platform was a large, muscular, lightly tanned man with his black hair in cornrows and a large handlebar mustache. He wore glasses with thin rectangular lenses, a white t-shirt and blue apron. He nodded, but didn't say anything. Instead he got up, removing one of the wooden panels he was sitting on to reveal a large dark hole with a ladder leading down into it. Jinta followed them while grumbling. Climbing down the ladder took quite a while until eventually the hole opened up into a giant square room large enough to hold a city block with blue walls and ceiling. The ground was a rocky terrain. Raina looked around in amazement while still climbing down the ladder. So this is Urahara's basement, she thought, remembering the things Masaki had mentioned to her over the phone. It didn't take her long to find who she was looking for, as she found a group in the distance. It was Masaki having another training session with Ichigo and Ishida while they were being leisurely watched by a plush lion, Urahara, and the black cat. Raina gulped, watching the training, as it was rather Spartan. The orange head is her son, right? She wondered, questioning if that actually was the case with how ruthless Masaki was. The first to notice their arrival was Urahara, who was watching her intently. His eyes were covered in the shadow of his bucket hat. It was quickly replaced with a big smile, but you could still see a hidden glint in his eyes if you looked close enough. Oh my. And who do we have here? He asked excitedly. As soon as Urahara called attention to them, everyone stopped what they were doing and watched in curiosity, except for Masaki, who ran towards Raina with a wide smile. Raina-chan. She shouted. She pulled Raina into a big hug, who returned it in kind. Masaki pulled back to take a look at Raina. I'm so glad you were able to make it here, she said. Raina smiled awkwardly, looking at everyone that was staring at the two of them. Why yes, you too, she said. Urahara chuckled. Are you going to introduce the rest of us to this young lady? He asked. Rain swore the black cat seemed to roll its eyes at him. I must be imagining things, she thought. 91 Raina meets the cast. Masaki coughed awkwardly. Alright. Well, it looks like you already met Jinta-kun, Yuru-chan, and Tessai-san, she said, pointing at the three that had led Raina there. Raina nodded. Well, they didn't introduce themselves, but I figured out Jinta-kun and Yuru-chan's names already. I hadn't been introduced to Tessai-san yet though, she explained. The large muscular man, Tessai, hummed in agreement while nodding. Masaki smiled. Now more important. This handsome boy is my son, she said, dragging Ichigo over to Raina. Ichigo deadpanned. Oh, now you have positive things to say about me, he grumbled. Masaki simply ignored his grumbling though. Ichigo, this is Raina. She has been one of the ones taking care of me. It might have been a rough start, but we're practically best friends now, she said with a wide smile. Raina smiled, touched by Masaki's words. Masaki wasn't the only one that felt that way, since she had long become Raina's best friend too after all. Living together for so many years, the only results really can be either despising each other or growing genuine love and care for them. She smiled at Ichigo. Hi, I'm Raina. We might not have met before, but your mother can't stop talking about you so it doesn't feel like a first meeting, she said with a chuckle. Masaki blushed a little. I don't talk about him all the time, she said in embarrassment, trying to defend herself. Ichigo seemed to be the most embarrassed out of all of them, not used to being talked about in such a way. It didn't help that Raina was a very attractive young woman. He wouldn't admit whether she looked better than Urahara. As if some type of sixth sense was activated, Urahara quickly came up, interrupting them, and bowed politely. Hi, I'm Inoue Urahara. Ichigo's best friend. She said. Raina chuckled watching the young girl. Even if Ichigo was too dense to see what was going on, she definitely wasn't. Not that it mattered though, since she wasn't interested in the boy. Not only was he too young, but he was even her best friend's son. That would be a recipe for disaster. It's a delight to meet you, she said. Urahara blushed. It was like punching a pillow. There was no resistance, making her feel awkward at her worries. And nice to meet you too, she said meekly. Masaki looked at Urahara with a raised brow. Friends? She asked. Urahara blushed and looked away. She wasn't used to being treated like that, and for the longest time she had made no progress in her relationship with the dense Ichigo. That was changing ever since his mother came back into the picture though, as she kept pushing for her to become her daughter-in-law. Masaki snorted at the girl trying to act ignorant, but decided to let her off for now, instead moving on to a straight-laced boy with chin-length black hair parted down the center. He was wearing a school outfit comprised of tan slacks and a white shirt with a blue and mustard diagonal striped tie. He wore a slim pair of glasses. This is another of Ichigo's friends, Ishida Yuryu, Masaki said. Ishida pushed up his glasses and nodded politely. Nice to meet you, he said flatly. Raina nodded back hesitantly. Hi, she said awkwardly, not knowing how to return his natural deadpan energy. Don't mind him, that's just how his personality is, Masaki said without care for Ishida's feelings. Urahara smirked. Leaving the best for last? He asked playfully. Masaki rolled her eyes. And this is Urahara Kisuke. Don't be fooled though. This old man is much older than he looks, she said with a smirk as she called him out. Kisuke grabbed at his heart dramatically. How could you? He asked. The smirk tugging at his lips was enough to give him away. He picked up the black cat. Anyway. This is Yorichi, he continued. Before Raina could react, the cat spoke in a deep voice. Hello. As he said, I'm Yorichi. Raina looked at the cat in surprise. Despite knowing about HALLOW, seeing a talking cat was something entirely new. At least now she was sure the cat had rolled its eyes at Urahara before. It was definitely smart enough for that. Urahara looked at Raina with interest. I hear you have an interesting power, he said. Leave the poor girl alone, Masaki warned him. He raised his hands in surrender, but Raina wasn't sure he had actually given up from his smile. Yorichi jumped down from Urahara's grasp and walked around Raina as if inspecting her. Raina had a conflicted expression as she kind of wanted to pet the cat, but wasn't sure if talking cats appreciated that kind of thing. The cat hummed as if considering something before walking away. Raina still looked a little confused, but shrugged it off. The only one missing right now is Chad, Ichigo's only other friend. He doesn't have very many due to his personality, Masaki said. Ichigo looked offended. I have friends. He argued. Masaki smiled. I have yet to meet any, she said, continuing to tease her son. All Ichigo could do was grit his teeth and bear it. Rain shook her head. So. Anyway. What did I interrupt? She asked out of curiosity. Masaki's smile grew even wider. Nothing much. Just some more training. Ishida-kun here did something reckless and lost his Quincy powers, so we are working on fixing that. Meanwhile, I have been training Ichigo at the same time since things should never have gotten to that point in the first place. If only his mother had been around to correct him, she sighed with a hand on her cheek. Ichigo snorted while looking away from her. I was doing just fine. He started saying. Masaki glared at him quickly, shutting him up, causing a mirthful chuckle to escape Reina's lips, only embarrassing Ichigo even further. Reina rolled her eyes at the two, but understood the two had a lot of time to make up for, so it was good to see their relationship was still good. 92 questions and suspicions. Masaki went back to training Ichigo and Ishida to their great displeasure. It wasn't like they were given a choice though. Reina ended up sitting on some old school beach chairs, the unfoldable kind with a wooden frame and cloth spanned between it to lay down on. Urahara had even put out a parasol for the sun that wasn't even present and provided them with fancy tropical drinks like they were at some kind of beach resort instead of watching Masaki beat train the two boys. Uru and Jinta seemed to be going through their own training program by sparring each other. Reina had joined Urahara and Oriime in watching the show. It didn't take long for Yorichi to show up and take sit on top of Urahara's head. After some small talk, things suddenly turned a little more serious. Urahara smiled kindly. So tell us more about yourself, he said nonchalantly. Yorichi also looked over curiously. Oriime seemed to be most excited of everyone, grabbing a hold of Reina's hands. Yeah, I want to know too, she said excitedly. I don't know. Most of it really wasn't that interesting. I lived in Naruki City my whole life. The one that has always stood out was Big Brother, she said humbly. If Masaki hadn't been distracted, she would have vehemently disagreed. Urahara and Yorichi seemed to perk up at the mention of her brother. Oh, that's not very far, is it? Oriime asked curiously. Reina smiled gently. No, it's just one town over. You can get there in less than an hour, she explained. Oriime nodded. She still hadn't let go of Reina's hands. So what do you do? Are you in college? She asked. Reina blushed lightly. Thanks, but I've already completed college. I am the CEO of a computer company, she said, trying to simplify it as best as she could for Oriime, who, though not outright stupid, didn't seem to be the brightest either. Oriime looked at her in surprise. No way. But you look so young, she said. Reina simply smiled. You mentioned you had a brother too. What does he do? Oriime asked curiously. Reina smiled awkwardly. Right. He died around 20 years ago, she explained. Oriime looked at her sadly and bowed towards her. Oh no. I'm so sorry, she said apologetically. No, you don't have to be. He came back, she said. He came back? Oriime asked in confusion. Well, he became a hollow, Reina explained. Oriime gasped, looking at her closely. That happened to my brother too. Are you okay? She asked with concern. She might have been wary about Reina at first, since she was worried Ichigo might be interested, but she felt bad for this young woman that experienced something so similar to herself. Reina smiled. Yeah. He was actually gone for over 10 years, but then actually saved me, she said. Urahara raised his brow. Are you sure it was actually your brother? He interjected. She shook her head. Yes, he knew things only brother would have known, she said. Urahara closed his eyes and seemed to be considering things. Are you sure? Some hollow can be quite tricky, preferring to manipulate their prey, Yorichi said. Reina glared at the cat. Yes. He has been protecting and helping me for over a decade, she said shortly, rather offended by the implication she was making. She breathed in deeply to calm herself down a little. He also saved Masaki twice and helped her get used to her new power. He didn't have to do any of that and could have just left her to die, she said to further her argument. Sorry, Yorichi said awkwardly. While they were distracted with their argument, Masaki had walked up. Now. You two don't bother her. I already told you Hisashi saved me and took care of me, she said. Urahara looked away awkwardly. Right, he said. I'm sorry, Reina. These two tend to get a little paranoid, Masaki explained. Reina gave her a weak smile. It's okay. I understand it might be hard to believe. Even more so if someone hasn't met him yet, she said. She looked at Urahara. My brother is the one that programmed the core of the operating system my company sells when he wasn't even 16 yet. If it hadn't been for him returning and helping me understand it, neither I nor anyone else would have been able to tease apart what he had done to create something so far ahead of the competition even 10 years after he originally created it. Are you telling me it's possible for just some hollow to do that? She asked with a little sarcasm sneaking into her question. I guess that would be hard. Urahara hesitantly admitted. Not only that, but he also knew more about this Aizen's plan than any of you know and was sharing that, she continued. Well, it has yet to be determined whether all of that is true, Urahara tried to argue. Raina glared at him. What has he done to wrong any of you? She asked. Urahara scratched the back of his head and chuckled. Oh. Nothing. But he admitted. No buts, Raina said. Masaki got between Raina and Urahara. She glared at the latter. Alright, no more of this. I invited her here to make friends. Not for some kind of interrogation, she said with finality. After everything you've been through, you should understand our concerns, Yoruichi cut in. Even if you don't believe him or Raina, are you saying you are also questioning my judgment after spending years with him? Masaki asked. Fine, Yoruichi said. That seemed to be the end of that argument. Well, now that we got that over and done with, how about you stay here for dinner? Masaki offered, trying to lighten the mood. Raina nodded and smiled. That would be nice, she said. Alright, let's celebrate with hot pot. Yuru, go ahead and get it started, Urahara said excitedly. Yuru nodded, heading upstairs. Jinta followed after her. 93 settling in. Back in Wo Mundo. Quite a few weeks had passed already since they joined Los Noches. Although more had happened than in most of his time in Wo Mundo that consisted of almost endlessly hunting other hollow to grow his power, with the only distractions being the girls, but surprisingly the headquarters of genius supervillain Aizen, filled with the most powerful beings in Wo Mundo, wasn't actually that much more eventful than he had grown used to. It seemed the Arrancar weren't much better than the Shinigami. They were all centuries old, just like many Shinigami, and they lived at a slower pace compared to regular humans, just like the Shinigami did. Their long lives lead them to view months the way the humans might view days. Just like how when you are young, waiting for your next birthday feels like an eternity, but by the time you are getting old, a year flies by in what seems to be the blink of an eye before you even notice it. Hisashi could feel his own perception slowly changing as he lived longer, but across all 3 of his lives he had still only experienced 59 years of life, which still left him with quite a human perception of time. Getting older and being around other hollow was causing it to skew more than it had during his time on Earth had, even as a hollow though. All of this meant life in Los Noches, though more eventful than simply hunting in Wo Mundo, was still quite slow-paced. He hadn't seen most of the high-ranking Arrancar all that much yet. Suruxi had still been visiting them quite regularly, trying to win over Harel and the Trebisches without success, though she seemed to be losing some steam as she realized she wasn't making any progress at it despite her continued efforts. Apaxi made it quite strained at times because she didn't give her the respect she really was expecting. Suruxi had grown less scared of Neliel as she spent more time with them and saw a completely different side of her, as she acted almost like a spoiled teenage girl around Hisashi rather than the stoic espada she had been used to before Neliel's original exile by Neutra. She still kept her distance, knowing Neliel could kill her with just a little effort. She was convinced it wouldn't take long for Neliel to take back her spot in the espada, and she would do anything for the spot Neliel would take to not be her own. Surprisingly, the ones he had been expecting most to cause trouble, Grimmjow Jajerjik and Neutra Gilga, had been surprisingly quiet. He knew that could only last so long though, as both weren't the type to just give up. Chances are Grimmjow was trying to ensure he had either grown stronger or improved his abilities as an Arrancar before giving it another try. As for Neutra though, he knew that Neutra, despite how he acted aggressively like Grimmjow did, deep down he was a coward. When he found out he couldn't beat Neliel in a fair fight, he didn't train. Instead, he schemed to take advantage of her weaknesses and stabbed her in the back when the chance presented itself. The only other Arrancar they had had some contact with were Loli and Meneli, as they tended to be Aizen's little messengers and errand girls that were used when he needed some stuff done that didn't require the most powerful Arrancar to take action. It made sense, since outside of their lack of power they were some of his most fervent followers in Los Noches. Probably the only person that had been as dedicated to him was the Shinigami girl, Hinamori Momo, who was his subordinate when he was still a captain in Soul Society. The other Espada hadn't really reached out in any way, but this hadn't been unexpected by him. Most of the others were rather neutral towards them, and to put it in a human perspective, it has been just a couple of days since they last met when they joined Los Noches. Unlike the other girls, Nelil had effectively moved into his bedroom permanently, not even choosing her own bedroom. They had decorated their temporary home, but only to a limited degree since they had already discussed things and knew they wouldn't be staying there too long if things went as planned. Nelil hadn't taken her spot amongst the Espada yet. Though Los Noches was quite lawless compared to Soul Society or Earth, there were still a few rules, and one of them was that you needed to beat a current Espada to become one. Even if she had been one prior, now that she had lost her position, she would actually need to beat a current Espada to take their numero. Originally he thought about having Nelil defeat Enoitra for his spot, but he was surprised to find she didn't actually have much of a drive to exact revenge on Enoitra and was far more interested in him and their newfound family instead. He wasn't as good of a person, and knowing what Enoitra had done to his sweet Nelil filled him with a desire to make Enoitra suffer. Due to this he had changed his mind, which would likely allow Enoitra to stay amongst the Espada a little longer as long as he didn't step out of line, so he could take appropriate revenge on Nelil's behalf. Instead he would probably have Nelil battle one of the lower-ranked Espada for their numero so she could reform her Frakian with them under her, at least for the time being. Dondakaka and Pest were somewhat the odd members out, as despite them originally being the closest members of her little family, they had already been overtaken by Hisashi and Harel. Meanwhile the Trebishes weren't far behind, making them nervous as they already couldn't keep up power-wise due to Enoitra forcefully destroying their masks. 94 completing missions. Harel had still been a little awkward. She had moved into the room beside Hisashi and Nelil, but things still hadn't quite gone back to the way they had been before Nelil returned to her adult form, nor had they settled into a comfortable new normal yet, as Harel was still adjusting. Hisashi couldn't quite blame her, as she had gotten closer to Nelil than any of the others except for him, but unlike him she'd had no clue that her child form wasn't her true form, so the sudden change must have been quite shocking. She seemed to have started treating her like a daughter, and suddenly the daughter turned out to be older and more powerful than herself even. Not only that, but Harel had also grown a bit closer to him at the same as they took care of Nell too. This had been perfectly fine when Nelil had been in her child form, however now it made things a lot more awkward since Nelil was still extremely close with him, but as an adult woman. This made Hisashi's relationship with Harel a little more awkward than it had been too, though still far better than it had been before Nelil and her Frakian joined their little group of misfits. He decided to remain positive though, expecting that they would eventually work things out and that all she needed was a little time before opening back up more again. He hoped so, at least, since he really liked Harel and was appreciating their new and improved relationship. Only time would tell. The Trebishes were almost the odd ones out, for nothing much changing. They had been with Harel for so long and had long grown used to being around Hisashi too. They actually ended up moving an extra bed to one bedroom and sharing it between the three of them. They said they had grown so used to it over the years that it felt strange to have separate rooms. Too quiet for them. Sung-sun, being the only not fully humanoid one among them, didn't have a bed and instead built a kind of nest on the floor that worked well with her snake tail. Beyond settling in, they had been dealing with some low-ranking missions for Los Noches that they were given to help them get used to how things worked and also to help the interests of Los Noches, or truthfully Aizen. The kinds of missions they had come across so far were as follows. Invitation missions. Just as they had been invited to join Los Noches, Aizen liked to invite promising hollows to join Los Noches. In rare cases like theirs, Aizen might show up. One level below that, an Espada might show up to negotiate the invite. Those were quite rare though, and most of these types of missions were left to the numeros, those below the Espada, which started at numero 11 based on the time they joined Los Noches. These missions simply required traveling to the party and trying to convince them to join Los Noches. Elimination missions. The name was pretty self-explanatory. There were some hollows and even natural Arrancar that didn't want to play nice with Aizen's plans and as such were in need of elimination. Those missions were handed out to members of Los Noches based on the estimated power of the targets. Research missions. This was a much broader group of missions. It ranged from things like acting as a guinea pig for Los Noches' research division to things like investigating, gathering various resources and potential guinea pigs in Wo Mundo for that same division. Interacting with the members of the research division was the worst part of those jobs. None of them seemed to be quite normal even when compared to the unusual standards for Wo Mundo. Some of the higher-ranked missions might even require travel outside of Wo Mundo, but those were reserved for actual Arrancar, so they hadn't had a chance to take any of those yet. Hisashi had been quite prolific, going on plenty of missions over the time he had been in Los Noches, sometimes joined by some of the other girls and even a handful of weaker numeros if the mission required it. The only ones unable to join in on any of them were Dondakaka and Pesche, who were forced to remain in Los Noches due to their weakness. He had been most particular about taking elimination missions for obvious reasons. It allowed him to travel outside Los Noches and consume more hollows to spur his growth to greater heights. For the same reason invitation missions were the second most common. He might not be able to hunt and consume the mission's target, but he could still hunt on the way there and back. Things might have been slowing down, but he wasn't going to stop working at it. Every little bit could help him and those dearest to him survive the things to come. He tended to avoid the research missions though. They were the least profitable for his goals, and he really didn't like interacting with the research division, least of all Cielaparo, partly because he creeped him out and also because he struggled to contain his killing intent for him. Since he and Noitra were the ones that injured Nelil, those two were probably the two he hated most in Los Noches. At least currently. Though some of the other Arrancar annoyed him, those two, if the opportunity presented itself, he would definitely kill them. Hisashi was reviewing his progress. Plus 6 weeks to H. Plus 4,100,733 XP from HALLOW. Plus 200,970 spirit power from HALLOW. Plus 184,892 spirit power from spiritual energy absorption. Plus 10 levels. Plus 10 stat points. Status panel. Name, Saito Hisashi. Soul age, 59. Race, HALLOW. Rank, Vasta Lord. Level, 272/282. XP, 143,457/399,030. Stats. Strength, 325. Dexterity, 658. Constitution, 175. Intelligence, 260. Spirit power, 4,335,149/4,721,011. Available stat points, 0/10. Passive skills. Spiritual energy absorption. Ultra speed regeneration. Acidic touch. Silencioso. Active skills. Soul body separation. Spirit power concealment. Illusory aura. Blute. Energy blade. Transcribe. Hachijio Sogai. Sero. Kumin. Negation. Skill infusion. Sonido. Korinzanjutsu. Let's put 5 in strength, 2 in dexterity, and the rest in intelligence, he told the system. Strength, 325/330. Dexterity, 658/660. Intelligence, 260/263. Available stat points, 10/0. 95. Challenging the hierarchy. Los Noches. Harel, Apaxi, Sung Sun, Mila Rose, Dondakaka and Pesche were walking through Los Noches' myriad hallways under Hisashi's lead. Over their time here they had slowly adjusted to Los Noches' confusing nature. Even if a lot of Los Noches looked exactly like most other parts of it, giving everything an uncanny feel and making it easy to get lost, eventually you would start remembering the entire complex and stop getting lost. At least for most. Some of the dumber HALLOW and Arrancar might struggle for much longer. Finally they left the outer structure, arriving at Los Noches' large inner space under the giant dome that imitated a normal sky, as if they were on Earth or Soul Society instead of Wo Mundo. It was a marvel, one that actually brought some relief to Hisashi. Unlike the other HALLOW and Arrancar, he could still clearly remember his life as a human. It wasn't even that long ago for him. Spread out in the large space were the Espada palaces, and today one of them was their destination. Gantenbane Mosqua's palace, to be precise. He was the current numero 10 Espada number 10. In the original timeline he would have at some point been replaced by Yami Largo. At least by the time Yami joined Ulquira to attack Karakura town. They arrived to find Nelil already there, facing Gantenbane. They weren't alone though. Quite a few Arrancar were watching what was going on, some from nearby. Others keeping their distance. However, this was the most high-ranking Arrancar they had seen at the same time since their first arrival and meeting with Aizen and the Espada. Suruxi waved at them to come over with a large forced smile. "Finally you guys are here," she exclaimed. Having no other plans, they ended up joining her watching spot. Apaxi snorted. "Aren't you just early?" she said. Sung Sun smiled. Come on Apache. Don't be like that, she said. Mila Rose was probably the most excited among them. We wouldn't be late. How could we miss such an exciting battle? She said with a wide smile staring between Neliel and Gantenbane. Suruxi just shook her head in exasperation at their antics. Well, I saved you a spot, she said. Hisashi smiled at her. Why thanks, he said politely. She looked at him in disgust. I wasn't talking to you, she said with a sneer. Hisashi rolled his eyes. He was already getting used to her bitchy antics. She thought he was weak and didn't get the benefit of her wanting more female Arrancar as part of her frackie, and so unlike the girls he got the full brunt of her bitchiness. Harel simply ignored Suruxi. Sung Sun smirked seductively. Come sit with us Hisashi, she said teasingly, ignoring Suruxi's behavior. He smiled sitting down next to her. Always a pleasure, he said, causing her smile to widen. It didn't take long before Harel actually sat down next to him and leaned against his shoulder with hers without saying anything. He smirked slightly. Comfortable? He asked her playfully. She simply humphed, not agreeing nor disagreeing. She didn't move away though, her eyes fixed on Neliel. Dondakaka and Pescht sat together a little further behind them. They didn't have the courage to sit too close to Suruxi lest they get caught up in one of her outbursts. Hisashi surveyed the surroundings. On a pillar not too far in the distance he could see Enoitra and another male Arrancar with short sandy blonde hair and a black eye patch covering his right eye with a turquoise marking on his cheek just below it. Enoitra still seemed frustrated and was watching closely. Hisashi suspected he was mostly there to see what Neliel's power was like after her return so he could decide how to deal with her and them. There were small groups of Arrancar all over the place spectating, ready for what was to come. He couldn't see Aizen anywhere, but he was sure he was watching from somewhere somehow. Gantenbane was standing atop his palace looking down on Neliel. Are you sure you want to do this, Neliel? He yelled. Despite their positions with him looking down at her and yelling at her upon closer inspection, it was clear who was holding the upper hand. From the look in Gantenbane's eyes and the barely perceptible shake of his hand when contrasted with Neliel's completely relaxed demeanor, it was clear he was worried about the outcome of today. It had only been just over a month since they joined, but Neliel had already come to challenge him for his spot in the Espada. He had hoped, even expected for her to challenge one of the higher-ranking Espada. She was originally the numero 3 Espada 3. Why would she go for his much lower rank? Unfortunately for him, Neliel's goals were not the same as they had been before her temporary exile. Now their only goal for the moment was for one of them to get an uncontested spot on the Espada so they could all be the Frackian below that Espada and avoid as much conflict as they could while they figured out things in Los Noches and took the time to grow. Neliel simply nodded. She wasn't worried. Gantenbane was not her match. He hadn't been before and she doubted much had changed since then. Gantenbane shook his head and sighed. Unfortunately, an Espada couldn't reject a challenge for their position, so despite knowing the futility of what was going on, he had no choice. He jumped down from his palace and grasped his Zanpakuto. Surprisingly, unlike most, it wasn't a sword and was instead a pair of red two-pronged punch daggers attached to bracelets on his wrists. Neliel placed her hand on the handle of her Zanpakuto. Hers was in the shape of a katana with a green wrap on the hilt matching the green sheath and a tsuba-guard, shaped like two silver crescent moons joined back to back. She slowly unsheathed it, revealing the blade. All the spectators quieted down as they watched the two of them. Gantenbane got into a combat-ready position while Neliel maintained a relaxed pose. They both stood still for a while as the pressure mounted, trying to find an opening to attack. 96 Unfair fights. Gantenbane's body twitched as he repositioned himself for an attack. Before he could even make his move though, Neliel had disappeared from her spot, having moved right in front of him with Sonido and slashing towards him. He only barely managed to catch her blade with his two-pronged punch daggers, requiring both arms just to barely block her attack. Sparks flew where their Zanpakuto met while he was pushed back. Once he managed to stop her attack though, he tried to lock in her sword with his left push dagger while pulling back his right hand, punching towards her abdomen. She managed to slip her blade out and jumped back, taking her distance, preventing him from landing the strike. She shifted her Zanpakuto to a high grip and dashed at him again, using Sonido, sending countless stabs towards him. He did his best to dodge the rapid succession of stabs, but despite his best efforts, cuts kept appearing across his body as he was struggling to keep up with her speed. She kept pushing her offense, pressuring him with relentless attacks that cornered him with seemingly no way to escape. Unable to return the offense, he suddenly charged his fist up, energy coating it as he slammed it down at the ground, causing it to shake and kick up dust, forcing back Neliel for just a moment. It was long enough for him to take some distance. Electricity sparked between the two prongs of his push daggers. He dashed back at Neliel, energy flowing from his fist as it rocketed towards her. She deflected his push dagger with the flat of her blade, diverting it away from her to the side, then continued the motion to spin and kick him against the side of the head, sending him spinning and bouncing across the ground. After a couple bounces, he managed to catch himself, leaving gouges through the sand. Some blood leaked from the side of his mask down his cheek and onto the white sand. He wiped away the blood to prevent it from getting in his eye. His breathing was labored, unlike Neliel, who still seemed in complete control. Suruxi watched Neliel closely and gulped. It seems she hasn't lost her power after all, she thought to herself, thankful she wasn't the one receiving the beating. He saw she smirked as he enjoyed watching her nerves build. Harel had wrapped her arm around his tightly while staring at the fight intently. It was clear she was worried for Neliel despite her outclassing her opponent. The Trebishes seemed to be enjoying how Neliel was showing the power of their group with proud smiles on their faces. Gantenbane tried to push his sonido to the limit as he disappeared from where he was standing, appearing behind Neliel. He swung his right fist, crackling with energy, up at the side of her waist. "You know," he yelled. Unlike his expectations, though, Neliel managed to lift her Zanpakuto between her waist and his fist, blocking the powerful strike at the last moment. She was pushed back a few steps, but to his dismay suffered no damage. It didn't even manage to leave her open for the second strike in his combo, cutting it short instead. With a flick of her wrist, her Zanpakuto slashed across his torso. He dodged back, but wasn't able to do so completely, leaving a cut all the way up to his shoulder. Blood flew through the air in the moment before the wound managed to close up enough to stop the worst of the bleeding. He saw she wasn't yet used to these battles with the Arrancar, most of which had given up on their high-speed regeneration ability, leading to wounds healing much slower than most Ajuches even. It made for much gorier fights, as Gantenbane was already covered in numerous bleeding cuts all over his body. Gantenbane jumped back and in his desperation charged a Sero while mid-air and fired it at Neliel, hoping to catch her off guard. She looked unperturbed though. Neliel suddenly opened her mouth, sucking in all of the energy of the Sero as if it was some kind of food. Before Gantenbane could respond, she exhaled, firing off a purple Sero twice as large as she had consumed. It was finally there. Her unique skills, the Sero Doble. It allowed her to absorb a Sero and send it back at twice the power to devastating effect. She was still too soft though, as her Sero Doble had barely even grazed Gantenbane, and he saw she was sure if she had intended to hit him, then there would have been no way for him to escape it. She simply outclassed him that much. She still didn't like hurting others deep down though, and always tried to avoid it when possible. Gantenbane gulped, watching the huge gouge out of the surface left behind by her Sero Doble, well aware of what the result would have been if it hit him. Eventually, after considering for a few moments, he sighed and dropped his Zanpakuto, leaving both blades hanging from his wrists while he held his hands up as if he had gotten serious. He shook his head. "As expected, I'll have to get serious," he said regretfully. He cracked his knuckles. "Exhale, Dragra," he shouted. A burst of energy escaped him, kicking up the sand and dust, obscuring everyone's view of him. Everyone could sense his spiritual pressure skyrocket. Neliel didn't interfere with him unleashing his resurrection, more than happy to let him give it his all. When the smoke cleared, his new form was revealed. The red push daggers had changed to look like claws or even fangs, connected by white gold-rimmed segmented plates, like an armadillo, that covered up his arms and connected over the back of his shoulders. Another series of segments came down his back, ending in a hard sharp point at the end like some kind of tail. The rest of him remained unchanged though. He pulled down his mask to cover his eyes like a pair of glasses. 97 expected results. Neliel assumed a defensive stance, but didn't actually unleash her own resurrection. She was still confident she could take him on without it. Gantenbane was actually smiling. It seemed his resurrection had helped him regain some of his confidence. "You'll have to get serious now," he said confidently. Orange balls of energy formed in front of his fists. He strafed around her using Sonido. Using any opening he saw, he fired off one of the balls into a orange blast, hurtling at Neliel. She parried the blasts with her Zanpakuto, and unlike before, it actually seemed to have some effect as it forced her back, but to his dismay her stance remained unbroken. She dashed towards him with Sonido, catching him off guard. He managed to barely use his resurrection's carapace to block the blade, causing sparks to fly as it cut a gouge in it. He grunted and his arm shook against the blade as he struggled to resist the impact. The resistance only lasted for a moment before the force of the impact sent him flying back until he crashed into one of the pillars littering the interior space of Los Noches. His body was embedded in the pillar. It took a few moments for him to extricate himself and shake off the debris. Neliel sighed. "It will take more than that to get me serious," she said. She wasn't even trying to insult him, but that just made the whole thing more embarrassing. Gantaban looked at the damaged carapace and frowned. He dashed in closer and sent another blast at close range, pushing back Neliel with consecutive blasts, preventing her from retaliating. The relentless blasts tore up the surroundings, and some of the spectators even had to dodge to avoid the collateral damage caused by the fight. Hisashi looked over at Enoitra, who was still spectating, and noticed he looked less than pleased. Although he was much stronger than Gantanbane, would he be able to handle him so easily without even using Resurrection? He wasn't sure, but a part of him deep down doubted it. Hisashi simply shook his head. He would make sure Enoitra would get his soon enough. He wasn't sure if he was strong enough quite yet, but Neliel definitely was more powerful than him once again and had hopefully learned her lesson from last time and would be harder to trick a second time. Meanwhile, Hisashi was still growing much faster than any other hollow even at their level. Neliel deftly blocked and parried the attacks until Gantanbane finally paused for a moment, providing her with an opening. She immediately took advantage of it, jumping up and sending her knee into his chin with a resounding crack, sending his head up, his body following after it as he was sent flying back. His mind blanked for a moment from the impact, giving Neliel the opportunity to hit him with a bicycle kick to the head that sent him careening back to the ground uncontrollably. He hit the ground at high speed, leaving a crater around him. Neliel remained standing mid-air, forcing him to look up at her. "It is better if you give up now," she advised him. She had been going easy on him already, using kicks rather than her sword most of the time to reduce the amount of damage she could inflict on him. With his hierro, though the kicks hurt, it was much better than using her Zanpakuto that could easily slice through it. Gantanbane smirked. "I don't think so. I haven't shown everything I have yet," he said confidently. Neliel shook her head in disappointment. "Is there a need to be so stubborn?" she asked. Gantanbane struggled back to his feet. "You wouldn't understand," he retorted. Gantanbane connected his fists together, the red claws surrounding them forming something akin to a beast's maw. "Ruger del Dragon," he yelled out. Energy started collecting in front of it, forming a large ball of energy before bursting forth into a giant beam of energy with the shape of a dragon's head at the front, barreling towards Neliel. The girls around Hisashi held their breath, watching closely. None of them were used seeing fights on this level. Even less so from Neliel, who wasn't all that interested in fighting in general, often sitting out when they battled other hollow. Against his expectation, Neliel inhaled the attack again, though it took longer to consume the entire blast this time. At first it seemed everything was fine, but upon closer inspection they could see small cracks forming around Neliel's mouth. Unable to contain it, she fired it back again at twice the size. Unfortunately, unlike her intentions, she wasn't able to avoid hitting him since she didn't have the time to aim, and escaping the giant beam she sent back was near impossible. Unfortunately, it seemed the attack had exceeded the limits of her Cerro Doble, as the cracks around her mouth grew even worse as she exhaled the overpowered attack. Right before the blast reached Gantanbane, a figure appeared between him and the blast. It turned out to be Aizen. He hadn't even unsheathed his Zanpakuto. "Bakudo number 81. Danku," he said casually. A thin translucent white square barrier appeared in front of him. The beam crashed into the barrier right as it formed, but despite the barrier's weak appearance it held strong, blocking the beam and forcing it to split around it, splashing beams of energy all around. None of them managed to hit Aizen nor Gantanbane though. Aizen looked completely unaffected, the only thing giving away the chaos going on around him being his coat ruffling in the winds caused by the violent clash before him. He smiled softly. "I think we can all agree we have a winner for today's match," he said with finality. Gantanbane lowered his head, looking at the ground in defeat. His Resurrection form slowly dissipated, leaving him in his regular form. He sighed. "Yes. Aizen-sama," he eventually managed to say. 98 pleasant surprises. Harel hugged Hisashi excitedly. She did it, she said. Hisashi smiled watching her infectious excitement. It was rare for her to lower her walls like this after all. Oh, congratulations, Suruxi said with a smile. She was trying to seem positive, but it was noticeably lacking in sincerity. Even though she got to remain as an espada for now, this would still be throwing a spanner in her plans after all. She knew now that they had an espada amongst their group, the odds of the rest joining Nelliel's Frakian over hers would be immense after all. She hadn't spent near as much time with them as Nelliel had. That's our Nell for you, Apache said proudly, almost as if it had been her that had won the challenge. Hisashi rolled his eyes at her behavior. Did you expect anything else from a former espada? He asked facetiously. Suruxi glared at him. I wasn't congratulating you, she said with a sneer. Jack will have to reward her, Sung Sun said with a teasing smirk. Mila Rose hugged Apache. Great. So when are we going to do the same? She said with a competitive glint in her eyes. Hisashi shook his head with a smile. We still have a ways to go before we can do the same, he said. It wasn't entirely true, as he suspected he could already defeat some of the weaker members of the Espada even as a Vasta Lord, but that was not something he wanted Aizen or anyone loyal to him to be aware of. At least not anytime soon. Apache smirked. Just watch me, she said excitedly, only egging on Mila Rose further. Mila Rose smirked back. You'll have to just enjoy coming in second after me, she said. This caused Apache to frown. Hisashi chuckled. How are you going to come in first when Nell has already done it? He asked. Apache rolled her eyes. She doesn't count, duh, she said. Of course she counts, Harel interjected. Of course Harel-sama, Apache said quickly. Hisashi smirked. He could almost see her wagging her tail at her master's command. Woof, he said teasingly. He could see a vein form on Apache's forehead. She seemed like she could explode any second. Don't think I'm not also going to beat you, she threatened him and jumped up on him, trying to get him in some kind of headlock with her arm around his neck, trying to choke him. Unfortunately for her, the only thing it achieved was pressing her less than optimally comfortable chest into his cheek. Rather than the pillowy softness he would prefer, he could feel her bones instead. He raised his hands. I give, he said in a deadpan tone. Apache tisked, but let him go anyway. Just you wait, she said. Sung Sun's teasing smirk as she watched them only exacerbated her annoyance. A widely smiling Nelliel barreled towards Hisashi at high speed. Jack, she shouted excitedly. He wasn't surprised by her exuberant behavior, as she liked to glump on him in general, and excitement only exacerbated this tendency. Something he didn't expect though was right as she jumped up to him, her arms wrapped around his neck. She leaned forward and before he could react, her soft lips suddenly pressed up against his, shocking him. They had been close to the point of even sleeping and cuddling together, but they had never moved beyond that. Hisashi was never sure what to make of their relationship. Between how they first met while she was in her child form and formed an almost sibling-like relationship. How unlike him she was still a hollow, first and foremost unlike him who had managed to keep most of his humanity from the moment he died until now. Rather than a semblance of his consciousness only re-emerging after becomes an Ajuchas, Vasto Lord, or Arrancar. He still had his human memories and most of the feelings. There was their situation being in Wo Mundo and now Los Noches, constantly being hunted or hunting. Then when he healed her they remained close. Closer than before even maybe, but he never felt confident taking another step in their relationship. Now she had taken it instead though. It took him a few moments for his brain to catch up with what had happened. Her kiss was messy due to lack of experience as she just pressed her lips against his instinctually while he stared at her wide eyes in surprise without responding. When his brain finally caught up he carefully wrapped his arms around her, closed his eyes and started returning the kiss, savoring the soft texture of her lips on his. Her arms tightened around his neck, pressing her body into his after he started responding as she tried her best to act on the instinct. Her hands ran through the mane of hair that escaped from below his mask. He could feel every curve of her body pressed against his. Part of him regretted being unable to hold her in his hands, but those thoughts didn't last long as he got caught up in the excitement and pleasure of the moment. They were finally interrupted by an awkward cough. Everyone around them was looking at them with a variety of emotions painted on their faces. The Trebishches and the other Nell Don P thieves all looked surprised. Though Harel also looked surprised, she seemed to be a little annoyed too. Suruxi though looked like the entire thing kind of disgusted her. They finally broke the kiss, their lips parting a few inches. Neliel had a shy smile as she gazed up into his eyes with a blush. "Thanks, I couldn't have done it without you," she whispered softly. He saw she smiled. "Sure you could have. It just would have just taken a lot longer," he said, his smile slowly turning to a smirk. Neliel pouted a little, but Hisashi's gaze turned a little more serious. "So what does this mean?" he asked her. 99 congratulations are in order. Neliel rolled her eyes. "I think you know what this means," she said. He saw she smiled. "What if I want to hear you say it though?" he asked. She blushed, hiding her face in his chest. It seemed the momentary confidence after beating Gantenbane and regaining her position as an espada had run out. He rubbed his cheek on the top of her head. Her hair smelled nice and fresh. "Well, cat got your tongue?" he teased. Fine. I like you." "Is that what you wanted to hear?" she said. He smirked. "That's exactly what I wanted to hear," he said. When he agreed to the mission that led to finding Nell 2 with the intent of gaining a powerful potential ally, he never would have dared to expect things to go this way. He would have been happy just succeeding in making her an ally. Getting a beautiful girlfriend was something he never thought of being a possibility when he left for Wo Mundo. He wasn't going to complain though. Even amongst the many beautiful women in the Bleach universe, Neliel stood out as one of the most beautiful. The only thing he could curse was that even as a Vasto Lord they couldn't do much beyond kiss, and she could cuddle him. His hollow bone armor covering most of his body was part of him and couldn't be removed, and his blades prevented him from doing more than wrap his arms around her carefully, even with her hierro as protection. It was just one more reason on top of the many he already had for becoming an Arrancar. They were broken out of their moment by a Paxi who was making fake gagging sounds not too far from them. He saw she glared at her for ruining the moment. This was the first success he had with a woman in decades. Even if it wasn't a human woman, it still counted. Apaxi just acted like she didn't see it though. Suruxi sighed. "Congratulations on your victory," she said begrudgingly. Mila Rose came up smiling, not caring about the atmosphere, and just hugged the hugging couple tightly. "I'm so proud of you, Neliel," she said loudly. Neliel smiled softly. Harel seemed a little annoyed. "Are you just going to forget about me?" she asked. He saw she smiled, seeing her reaction. "How could we ever forget about you?" he asked. She shook her head. "I wasn't talking to you," she said. He overacted like he had been hurt deeply. "Ouch," he said dramatically. She just rolled her eyes in response though. Neliel smiled and beckoned Harel over. Harel hesitantly closed in on them when Neliel grabbed her hand and pulled her into the middle of their group hug. Harel blushed, but beyond a sigh didn't fight it. He saw she shook his head, but couldn't suppress a smile either. These girls had really come a long way over the years they had known each other. Sung Sun chuckled. "Now I'm feeling left out," she said playfully. Aizen approached. There was a tall thin man following a few steps behind him. He had sleek silver hair down to his ears. His eyes squinted to thin slits so much it seemed they were closed at all times. His wide mocking smile never seemed to fade. He wore the standard Shinigami Shiakusha made up of a white shidaji shirt, a black kasode jacket, a black hakama pants, a white hakama himo cloth belt, white tabi socks, and wore edgy straw sandals. The only thing that set him apart was the bright contrasting minimalist white long overcoat he wore over it all. Like Aizen, he lacked any hollow mask and only had a zanpakuto that poked out from under his overcoat, indicating he was a Shinigami rather than a Arrancar. Ichimaru Jin. Due to his slitted eyes, Hayashi had trouble telling where Jin was looking, but he felt it was him and Neliel. "My oh my," Jin said teasingly, his mocking smile never leaving his expression. Aizen just seemed to ignore his behavior though, sporting the same seemingly kind smile he usually did. "Congratulations on your victory, Neliel. I didn't expect anything less from you," he said. Neliel nodded, but didn't seem very interested. Her focus was still primarily on Hisashi. Aizen's smile turned a little awkward. "You'll have to come with us for a little to get reinstated as an espada," he clarified. Hisashi patted Neliel on the back and smiled at her when she looked up at him. "We'll see you later," he told her. She seemed a little disappointed, but eventually nodded, letting go of him and breaking up the group hug. She left with Aizen and Jin, leaving them alone with nothing much to do. Apaxi jumped up excitedly. "Let's go pack for our move," she said. Now that Neliel had become an Espada again, they would be able to be part of her Frakian and live in her palace. A big upgrade from their already rather luxurious accommodations. It didn't take any convincing to get the rest to agree. Even a grumbling Suruxi followed them. Their actions indicated they were already planning on joining Neliel, and she wasn't too pleased since she had been working for weeks trying to get Harel and the Trebishes to join her. The other Espada and Frakian watched them closely as they left. It was clear things would be changing in Los Noches going forward. Between Neliel's miraculous recovery and the large group that returned with her, many of which were some of the most powerful beings in Wo Mundo if those in Los Noches were excluded. Some were excited while others were worried about what this would mean for the future of Los Noches, or at least their future in Los Noches. They were walking down the many winding hallways of Los Noches when suddenly they felt a lot of pressure bearing down on them out of nowhere. Standing there was Enoitra with his oversized double crescent halberd. Despite his smile, he was anything but welcoming though. 100 unexpected help. Enoitra's smile turned to look more like a smirk. Look who we have here, he said playfully. Harel, Hisashi and Suruxi managed to withstand the pressure without too much difficulty, but the same couldn't be said about Sung-sun, Apaxi, Mila Rose, Dondakaka, and Pescht, who struggled under the weight the pressure brought. Harel and Hisashi stepped forward, taking the brunt of spiritual pressure Enoitra was giving off. It took Suruxi a little longer before she realized what was going on. She seemed to hesitate for a moment, but eventually she stepped forward too. What are you doing here, Enoitra? She asked him accusingly. He shrugged carelessly. Despite his casual behavior, the pressure didn't decrease. Nothing in particular, he said. He walked towards them, the pressure increasing as he neared them step by step. Hisashi was starting to question if he should unleash his own pressure to counter Enoitra's and protect the others. He knew he had plenty of spirit power to counter Enoitra's spiritual pressure. Not only that, but his spiritual pressure seemed to be more efficient than anyone else he had come across so far. It was like every unit of spirit power allowed him to put out more pressure than a single unit of spirit power did for everyone else. Although he really would rather not. If he did, it would be very suspect. Being in Los Noches, he could never be sure when Aizen was watching, and even if he wasn't, he wouldn't put it past Enoitra to report him to Aizen to get back at them and weaken Neliel's faction, so he stood a better chance against her down the line. Moments before he decided to act, they were surprised when another wave of spiritual pressure crashed into Enoitra's, negating part of it and inflicting a pressure on Enoitra too. They could hear very faint footsteps approaching them from behind. After a few moments, Grimmjow walked past the girls, ending up beside Hisashi. He glanced over at Hisashi before his gaze settled on Enoitra. Don't even think about going after my prey. He's mine. He spat out arrogantly. Enoitra tisked. He was still pretty confident in acting unruly even with Suruxi present. He looked down on all the others since they weren't even Arrancar yet, judging them as barely even above ants. He also knew he was more powerful than Suruxi herself. He had no clue that Hisashi was probably around the same strength as Suruxi already, while he was underestimating the kind of power Vasto Lord held due to their rarity. Each of the Trebishes was on the level of an Ajuchas class Arrancar. This meant the situation was far less favorable than he liked to think. However, now that Grimmjow, another Arrancar who despite not becoming an Espada yet definitely had the potential to become one, had appeared, he no longer felt confident enough in acting as he pleased. Enoitra decided to give up for the day and walked off, the spiritual pressure slowly decreasing on them as he did so, causing the weaker ones among them to sigh in relief. When he finally disappeared into the distance, Grimmjow tisked. You should be fine now, but just you wait. Once I make it to Espada, you better be ready, because I'll be coming for you, he said, glancing over at Hisashi with a gleam of challenge in his eyes. All Hisashi could do is sigh. Not that he had expected any better, knowing Grimmjow's competitive streak. It was clear Grimmjow wasn't going to give up on challenging him until either he felt like he had regained his honor by defeating Hisashi, or was beaten so hard by him that he would think he wouldn't stand a chance no matter what he tried. Apaxi crossed her arms, snorting arrogantly. It's not like we needed your help, she spat back at him. Grimmjow didn't even deign to look at her. Like I care what happens to you. Go run after him if you're so confident, he said dismissively. Seeing him ignoring her, she frowned. Bastard, she murmured quietly. Sung-sun smiled awkwardly and patted Apaxi on the shoulder. Just ignore him. Although annoying, he did help us this time, she said with a sigh. Suruxi put on a smile. Nothing to worry about. Between me and Grimmjow there was nothing he could have done, she said, suddenly seeming much more confident now that Enoitra had left. It wasn't hard to see that it was mostly just bluster, as she had been more nervous than most of them when Enoitra showed up. The other girls had full confidence in Hisashi and Harel's ability to keep them safe. They had never let them down after all. Harel smiled, though it was quite perfunctory. "Thank you, Suruxi," she said. Suruxi crossed her arms below her moderate chest, emphasizing it unintentionally as she tried putting up a reliable front by puffing her chest. "Of course," she said, doing her best to sound confident after she had just been terrified by their encounter with Enoitra, who was several ranks above her amongst the Espada. Now that the excitement was finally over, they all worked hard to pack up their old living quarters for their move. Given how minimalist most of Los Noches was, it didn't take that long. To Hisashi's dismay, even Los Noches, the most developed part of Wo Mundo with sentient hollows around, had almost nothing as far as decorations or entertainment to distract from the monotony of life. Between his memories about soul society from his previous life and his experience in Wo Mundo this life, he felt confident saying that leisure and entertainment were quite unique to humans on Earth. Even the Shinigami, despite being uncorrupted human souls and visiting Earth to hunt hollow and purify souls, allowing them to see the culture of humans on Earth, didn't bring any of it back to soul society and were still living as if it was hundreds of years in the past. The only exception was technology related to souls and combat, which was far advanced. It wasn't like he could do anything about it at the moment, though. He hoped one day he could either bring some of it to Wo Mundo or at least spend more time on Earth again in a humanoid form once he became an Arrancar. Hopefully he had built enough goodwill through Masaki for Urahara to build him a Gigai compatible with Arrancar for him to use. He couldn't imagine it being difficult, considering he had already succeeded in building ones compatible with the Vizord. 101 Pale Palace. Those were concerns for the future, though. Right now he couldn't easily leave for Earth. Who knows how closely he was being watched since he joined Los Noches. Multiple members of Los Noches and Aizen had rather nasty hobbies, and being one of them didn't protect him completely from them either. If he received some kind of mission to go to Earth, it would be another matter, but now that he had joined up, if he went to Earth without reason that would get him attention he did not need at this time. As for the missions requiring Los Noches members to go outside of Wo Mundo, those tended to be reserved for Espada most of the time. He doubted he would even get the chance as long as he was a Basto Lord. He wondered how Raina was doing. Was she safe? Was work going all right? Even if she now had more power than any regular human and plenty of members amongst the supernatural, he would always worry about how she was doing. That's what big brothers do after all. And did Masaki's reunion with her family go well? How much did the timeline change now that she is back and involved in Ichigo's life again? Since due to the time dilation between the worlds it had only been a couple days at best since he returned, not too much should have changed yet. He was struggling with a lack of information though. Aizen was here, so it seemed that the plot had mostly gone the way it had originally, or else he would still be in Soul Society most of the time. Since he put all his effort in minimizing his influence on Ichigo's life, he really hoped they had all made it through alive like originally, or he would feel bad about leading to someone's death even if indirectly. He wasn't too worried about his parents. They were retired and the only contact they had with anything supernatural was Raina, who no longer lived with them. Unless something seriously went wrong, they would probably be the safest out of everyone he knew. That didn't prevent freak accidents though. Hollow attacks were not common, but they did happen. He just hoped if that was the case Raina could protect them, or at least hold on for backup from Masaki. Loli and Menali showed up shortly after they finished packing to guide them towards their new home. They seemed more respectful than before now that Nelil had become an Espada again, even if the respect was barely skin deep. He could almost feel the resentment simmering under Lily's skin, but she had to put on a fake polite smile while grinning it and bearing it. She was weak after all. The Espada palaces were all under the dome of Los Noches rather than inside the outer walls, so they needed to trek through the desert-like terrain, though at least the faux sky was a change of scenery from what they were used to after living in Wo Mundo all this time. Finally they came upon a huge structure that seemed to be a mix between a Western and Middle Eastern castle or palace. It had tall, thick white walls with plenty of towers topped with bulbous domes ending in pointy tips. It was quite ornate despite being completely white. At least it was by Los Noches standards, where everything tended to just be unadorned white flat surfaces. Lots of flat white surfaces. Hisashi whistled looking up at the massive structure. Despite his rather long life, at least between his first 2 human lives and his third as a hollow, he hadn't seen too many impressive structures. In his first life he had thought he wouldn't die for a long time and wasted away a lot of time. Then his second he had been far too busy trying to get ahead to enjoy things. Finally, as a hollow, his life was just spent trying to survive and work towards surviving the future. The only impressive piece of architecture or even nature he had seen so far was when they finally came upon Los Noches, and even that was mostly just due to its sheer size. The architecture itself wasn't all that impressive besides said size. Aizen seemed to be far more concerned about function rather than form. Aesthetics weren't his main concern, even if he looked kind of fire after betraying Soul Society. Pulled a real Clark Kent. Finally they were led into some kind of throne room where a serious-looking Neliel was sitting on a throne. A distant look in her eyes as she stared into the distance. She looked rather majestic, like a queen. That only lasted for a second though. The moment she noticed Hisashi, she jumped off the throne and hugged him with no concern for the impression she gave. Gone was the majesty and left just the cute exuberant Neliel that they had come to know. "You're finally here," she shouted excitedly before burying her face in his chest. Hisashi smiled. "Of course we are. You'd think we were separated for years with how you're behaving," he teased. She just tightened her hug though. "How about we get moved in?" he asked. Lowly and mentally ended up giving everyone a tour of the place. Although Neliel got there a little before them, she was almost as unfamiliar with the place as they were. It hadn't been her palace when she was the numero 3 Espada, and she hadn't socialized a lot with any of the other Espada back then either. Really the only hollows she had any real relationship with was her Fraki, and the rest could barely even be considered acquaintances. The place was as large inside as it had appeared outside, with a large inner yard and lots of rooms. The towers had a great view, at least facing the decorative inner yard. The long stretch of sandy dunes and white walls in the distance didn't make for a great view for the outward-facing windows. Neliel insisted that they kept sharing a bedroom even after the move, and Hisashi was smart enough not to argue that. Moving took just as little time as moving out had. Hisashi hoped now that they were a faction under an Espada, they might be able to get authorization to get some more non-essential supplies to use for their fancy new palace. 102 bitter tears. After finally moving everything into their new bedrooms, Neliel pulled him out of the bedroom with an infectious smile on her face. "Come on, let's explore," she said excitedly. When leaving the bedroom they ran into Harel, who had picked the bedroom right across from them. She had blushed a little when she did. Hisashi had decided to not say anything about it for now. He wasn't quite sure how to deal with the situation regarding Harel. When Neliel had been in her child form, they had been growing much closer while they took care of her together. However, now that Neliel had returned to her adult form and advanced their relationship into the romantic realm, things had become rather awkward for all three involved. Though Neliel wasn't that affected, the other two were. "What are you two up to?" she asked curiously. Neliel smiled. "We were going to explore the palace. Why don't you join us?" she asked. Harel nodded. "Okay. I didn't have any plans anyway," she said. Hisashi was pleased to find the hallways were less monotone than those in the main Los Noches structure, even if it was still predominantly white surfaces, but there were at least some decorative elements, as one would expect in a palace, even if they were white to distract from the monotony. He wondered if Aizen had mysophobia for him to make everything pristine and white, as if they were in a hospital ward rather than a place to live. "You bastard, where do you think you're going without us?" he heard a Paxi yell. The Trebisches came running after them from a different hallway. Sung Sun crossed her arms under her chest with a smirk playing on her lips. "You weren't thinking of having fun without us, were you?" she teased. Hisashi smiled. "I wouldn't dream of it," he retorted, causing her smirk to widen. "Can we just get moving?" Mila Rose grumbled. Harel smiled, watching everyone get along. She had never expected it to be possible for things to be this way. At least not before they had met Hisashi. She had always felt melancholy ever since reawakening her consciousness as a hollow. Meeting the Trebisches had helped. After many years without change, finally their little family was growing once again, though. They all ended up exploring together. The new place was large enough that it required quite a few hours to explore the many rooms and courtyards. Truthfully, the place was far too large for their number of members, but this seemed to be the norm in Los Noches. Many of the Espada, despite having similarly sized palaces that could hold thousands of members, only actually had a handful of members in their fraction, with a few exceptions. Near the end of their tour they ran into Pest and Dondakaka, who were walking around aimlessly and listlessly. Upon seeing the others they hugged each other. "Nelsama has forgotten about us," Pest cried out. Dondakaka had tears streaming down his face while hugging Pest in return. Hisashi shook his head. Neliel tilted her head cutely. "Oh right. I forgot," she said casually, not realizing she was making things worse. The two original members of her fraction cried even harder. Hisashi sighed. "Alright guys. It's time to get registered as Neliel's fraction," he told them. They had spent enough time exploring, and being registered should prevent some issues with other members of Los Noches. There was a big difference between being part of an Espada's fraction and being an unaffiliated member of Los Noches. That seemed to calm the two drama queens down some. It had been quite a while since they had officially been part of Neliel's fraction, and they were eager to do so once again. This time it was Neliel's turn to lead them, as she was most familiar with the layout of Los Noches. Thankfully, registering only took a little time. The one managing their registration was a rather plain-looking female Arrancar he didn't recognize. She was so plain she actually made Loli and mentally stand out in comparison. Then again, from his experience, the majority of Arrancar and hollows in Los Noches never appeared in the original manga nor anime. Only those high-ranking or unusual enough seemed to be worth appearing. The majority of forces in Los Noches were either there to support the Espada and fraction or be failed attempts at creating powerful Arrancar. Now that you've been registered as part of an Espada's fraction, the range of missions you are eligible to take have been expanded. "Would you like to take a look?" she asked. He looked around at the others. Some seemed unsure, some uncaring, and a few seemed raring to go. "Sure," he finally said. She pulled up the missions available with their new authorization. Upon closer inspection, there wasn't a huge change in the type of missions available. Just that a higher level of danger was present for them. The expectation was that members of a fraction would be working together to solve such situations, or possibly even worked together with the Espada leading them. Out of all of them, he was probably the only one that had such interest in completing missions. Unlike him, the others barely experienced growth anymore. Least of all with the kinds of targets most missions pertain to. Unlike him and his ability to absorb spirit power more efficiently and double up on the rewards with the experience the system granted, it was still worth it hunting down and consuming lower ranked hollow. For them though, the only thing they would see a reasonable return for would be consuming a hollow on their own level or above. Those were exceedingly rare outside of Los Noches. Meanwhile, those within Los Noches were off limits, at least if they weren't attacked first. Though clashes were still expected within the walls of Los Noches, anyone causing too much trouble would still be reprimanded. Since he had nothing better to do, he headed out to complete some missions and hopefully gain some experience and spirit power. 103 Bite the Apple. Back on Earth, August 21st. Raina had been staying with Masaki to take a small break from her work. She was hoping a break and some time away would help her get rid of the strange experience of feeling watched she had been having lately. She figured it might be stress, either from worrying about how Hisashi was doing in the hollow world he had told her about, or her work. A new environment and people might help get her mind off of it. They were sitting around the short-legged table in Urahara's shop relaxing. Raina could be more relaxed as she wasn't quite used to a traditional building like Urahara's shop. Although not completely unfamiliar, she was used to sitting at a regular table with a chair rather than kneeling on a pillow at one. She wasn't going to complain though. At least she didn't have to worry about release schedules and crunch for a week or so. Unlike the previous few days, Ichigo and his friends weren't present today. Masaki had only received a call from her son. Tessai bowed politely before refilling Raina and Masaki's teacups. Raina nodded at him thankfully, but then looked over at the nonchalant Urahara, who seemed to be rather relaxed, scratching the fur on Yoriki's chin. "Why are you going along with his schemes?" she asked Masaki. Masaki shrugged, but smiled widely. "I thought it would be funny, and it's good for him to get a different kind of training too," she said. Raina raised her brow. "So you trick him into believing his friends are endangered, fearing for their lives?" she asked. Masaki nodded. "Sometimes they need a little motivation," she said. Raina sighed, shaking her head in exasperation. "Sometimes I feel bad for your son," she retorted. Masaki had a soft smile as if Raina's words had no effect. Urahara chuckled. "Come on. They're having fun," he said. Raina rolled her eyes. She might not have known Urahara for long, but it didn't take long to realize Urahara liked messing with people. At least as a way to alleviate his boredom, and he seemed to be bored frequently. Raina exhaled laboriously. So they kidnapped Ichigo's little girlfriend? And then what? She asked. Urahara smiled conspiratorially. Well, he said drawn out. Unless they are able to get ahead of our cute little Rairin, Chad will end up being kidnapped too, he finished. And the point? Raina asked. Urahara smirked. Ichigo thinks now that they have saved Rukia and left Soul Society that they are perfectly safe, he said. Masaki nodded in agreement while sipping her tea. So I decided to teach them a little lesson on what can happen when you let down your guard. It will be even more fun when they don't know who is who, he continued with a wide smile. Just leave him to his games, Yoruichi said, stretching with a lazy yawn. Raina looked at the talking cat and kind of wanted to pet it too. She wasn't sure if it was appropriate though. The only person she had seen do it so far had been Urahara himself. That knowledge only made the temptation even greater though, as if it was some kind of taboo she would be breaking. Urahara looked over at Raina. That aside, I'm also very interested in you, he said. Raina frowned. Masaki shot him a glare, her gaze containing a significant warning. He seemed unaffected though. As unflappable as ever. I heard from Masaki you somehow gained powers too, he said with a curious gleam in his eyes. Raina raised her brow at Masaki, who responded with a simple shrug. Masaki knew Urahara had some personality problems, but at the end of the day she still trusted him. Raina sighed. Yes, I do have powers, she admitted. Urahara licked his lips. Since you're here anyway, would you mind if we go through some tests? He asked excitedly. He looked over at Masaki, who was still frowning. Of course you don't have to if you don't want to, he quickly added. Masaki sighed. I'm not leaving you alone with her Urahara, she said. Raina shot her best friend an appreciative glance. As Urahara's oldest friend, Yoruichi couldn't help but chuckle watching them and said, you'll be fine. I should know. He has never tried to make a move on me. Urahara unfolded his bamboo fan and hid his smile behind it, staring at her over the edge of the fan. See? Nothing to worry about. It's a purely platonic interest, he said. Raina stared at Urahara and Yoruichi weirdly. How is that even supposed to reassure me? So he isn't interested in male cats. Is that going to protect me? She wondered. Masaki chuckled. She said nothing, just drinking her tea while enjoying the show. I've got this machine. I promise it won't hurt. Well, maybe a little in the beginning, but it won't be that bad, he said. I don't think I should, she said hesitantly. You might figure out how to get stronger, he said, trying to tempt her. Raina seemed conflicted. I don't. Do you really think so? She asked. Urahara's smile widened. But of course. I'm a man of my word, he said. He spread his arms as if to show he wasn't hiding anything. Your power is entirely different than what I'm used to seeing. Just a few measurements and experiments and I might be able to figure out the source and how to train or strengthen it, he said. Raina bit her lip. If I got stronger I might be of more help to Hisashi. If I had been stronger would he have left? Urahara-san doesn't seem very trustworthy though. Despite tricking Ichigo, Masaki is still here. Should I take the risk? She thought. She looked over at Masaki again, who shrugged again. As unreliable as he may seem at first, he is usually quite reliable, she said. 104 false worries. To Raina's relief, Urahara's intentions were nowhere near as invasive as she had feared. She spent the rest of the afternoon doing as he asked. Besides having her wear some strange devices while doing it, he just had her go through the motions of using her powers. Sometimes he would have her repeat some things or direct her to try specific things. Urahara looked up at her from one of his devices with an excited gaze. How interesting, he said. She frowned. Could he stop with this cryptic shit? She thought. Anything in particular you would like to share? She asked in exasperation. He smiled. Oh. Right. I almost forgot about you. Though not a complete match, there is indeed a lot of overlap with the spiritual power signature HALLOW give off. It seems similar to Ichigo's little friends, though I haven't had a chance to play with them as much. They were in such a rush to get to Soul Society. Such a pity, he said. He seemed to get lost in thought. Could she consume spirits? He mumbled to himself. Raina frowned when overhearing him. We will not be testing that, she said with determination. He sighed dramatically. Such a shame, he said. She decided to just ignore it. How about something actually useful to me? She asked. He shrugged and smiled. I have some ideas, he said. Since your powers are at least largely based on the hollow system of power, you might be able to absorb ambient spirit particles like they do to grow. Unfortunately, the ambient density of spirit particles on Earth is barely even enough for them to sustain themselves, let alone grow. Worse yet, this only works for them at the lowest levels though. Once they evolve to the Menos Grande stage, the density on Earth isn't even enough to sustain them, forcing most to escape to Wo Mundo. Unlike them though, you have a living human body acting as a shell, protecting your soul. It shouldn't require as much spirit particles to maintain the power of your soul, he said. Raina wasn't sure exactly what he was talking about. Although he saw she had explained some of the basics to her over the years, he had never gone into depth about how souls, hollows, and Shinigami worked. She wasn't even sure how much of this her brother knew. Urahara was a strange one. He seemed to know more than anyone she knew. He tilted his head, pinching his chin, and looking at her thoughtfully. Have you noticed any growth in your power since you got them? He asked. Raina tried thinking about when she first got her powers to now, but eventually shook her head. I'm not sure. If I have, it wouldn't have been much and would have grown very slowly, she said unsurely. He tapped his lips slowly. Well, we can try having you train in an enriched spirit particle environment. If we simulate levels similar to Wo Mundo or Soul Society, the difference might become more noticeable. It's worth a try, he said. She looked a little intrigued. Does that mean I can go to Wo Mundo? She asked. No. Are you crazy? Masaki yelled from the side. Urahara had so many things he wanted to measure and try out they didn't finish until well into the evening. They retired up to Urahara's shop to enjoy some nabe hot pot together. During their after-dinner tea, an agitated Ichigo burst through the door in his Shinigami form, dragging his own body along. Mom! Are you here? He yelled. Ishida, Yuryu, and Abare Renji ran in moments after him. Masaki smiled and waved him over to them. She smiled patiently. What is it? She asked. He clenches his fist. We went back to Inu's house like the girl told us to, and Inoue was actually back home. Everything seemed normal, but then she suddenly attacked Chad. It turned out to be some glasses freak disguised as Inoue, he said. Ishida frowned. What do you mean by glasses freak? He asked. Ichigo coughed awkwardly. I wasn't talking about you. Don't take it so personal. You know what? That's not important right now, he said. Ichigo's gaze turned serious again. Then a ninja joined him and they kidnapped Chad too. They disappeared before we could even do anything. We couldn't even protect Chad. How can we save Inoue? They're picking us off one by one, he said. Urahara just smiled mysteriously, but said nothing. Raina almost couldn't resist rolling her eyes at Urahara. Masaki looked conflicted, but Urahara subtly shook his head. I'm sure you can save them. So what brought you here, sweetie? She eventually asked. He looked at Urahara. Urahara-san, could I leave my body here for a while? This is the only safe place remaining to leave it, he said. Well, I understand the situation. We'll look after your body, Urahara said. Ichigo pressed a bronze badge with a skull decoration on it against his body, causing a round green pill to pop out of its mouth. He stuffed the pill into the mouth of a stuffed lion. The stuffed lion suddenly sprang to life. What the hell was that for? It yelled aggressively. You're coming with me, Ichigo said. Oh. So you're finally acknowledging my abilities, huh? You should have told me earlier if that's the case. It responded with a smug look. They sat down at the table with them. Damn. What's with those guys? It was incredibly hard to fight them. Renji said. It means that there's more to fighting than just charging at your enemies, Ishida retorted. Could it be that Aizen is involved? Renji asked. Who knows? Ichigo said. Did you find anything out, Urahara-san? Ishida asked. I analyzed the telephone conversation, but there wasn't a Ryan, which is the spirit equivalent of a voice print, Urahara answered. What does that mean? Ichigo asked. Who knows? Urahara said mysteriously. Raina and Masaki glanced at each other. Masaki still seemed to be struggling to hold back from simply spilling the beans. At any rate, it means they're probably not humans or Shinigami, Urahara continued. The spiritual pressure of those three are definitely a little strange, Ishida agreed. You can tell? Ichigo asked. Ishida pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose. Your ability to sense spiritual pressure is as poor as usual, he said. Ichigo frowned. Shut up. He retorted. Masaki frowned and smacked him over the back of the head. Watch your language. Also, you do need to practice more, she said. Ichigo and Ishida felt a cold tingle travel up their spine that quickly shut them up. Tessai poured them all a cup of tea. If the enemy's power are derived from Kido, it will be difficult to get them using the Zanpakuto's direct attacks, he chimed in. They discussed their different attacks and which would be most effective to determine the best course of action in dealing with the kidnappers. They decided Ishida with his Quincy powers was their best bet. The enemy targeted Inoue Dono and Sato Dono first because they were easier to take out, Tessai said. Everything is going exactly as they planned, Ichigo said. The phone suddenly rang. Urahara answered with a smile. Thank you for your patronage. This is Urahara's shop, he said. Where's Big Brother? A girl's voice on the other end of the line said. Urahara held out the phone to Ichigo. Ichigo looked at it seriously before accepting it. It's me, he said. Let's continue our game at the Karakura Museum. Come with everyone. The girl said. Hey, wait. Hey. What happened to Chad and Inoue? Are they safe? Hey. Ichigo yelled. There was no answer though. He put down the phone. It seems they're at the museum, he said. Renji tisked. Again. He questioned. All right. This time, I'm with you. Put your minds at ease and follow me. The plush lion said arrogantly. As soon as Ichigo and his friends left, Masaki grabbed Urahara by the collar aggressively. He raised his hands in surrender with his usual smile still playing on his lips. You better not take this too far, she threatened. Raina just looked mildly confused. Despite their friends getting kidnapped and believing they are in danger, are they not going to ask why none of us are helping? She asked. 105 heated interactions. Wo Mundo, Los Noches. Hisashi walked through one of the many entrances to Los Noches. He had been working hard the last few weeks completing missions for Los Noches, or more importantly working on growing his own strength under the guise of completing missions. He took a quick glance at the progress he managed to make. Plus 7 weeks to H. Plus 5,467,644 XP from HALLOW. Plus 267,960 spirit power from HALLOW. Plus 215,707 spirit power from spiritual energy absorption. Plus 13 levels. Plus 13 stat points. Status panel. Name, Saito Hisashi. Soul age, 59. Race, HALLOW. Rank, Vasta Lord. Level, 282/295. XP, 59,554/436,600. Stats. Strength, 330. Dexterity, 660. Constitution, 175. Intelligence, 263. Spirit power, 4,721,011/5,204,678. Available stat points, 0/13. Passive skills. Spiritual energy absorption. Ultra speed. Regeneration. Acidic touch. Silencioso. Active skills. Soul body separation. Spirit power concealment. Illusory aura. Blute. Energy blade. Transcribe. Hachijio Sogai. Sero. Kumin. Negation. Skill infusion. Sonido. Korinzanjutsu. He looked at the panel in surprise. Oh wow, I finally managed to surpass 5 billion spirit power. I wonder how I measure up now, he thought. Let's put 5 in strength, 6 in dexterity, and the remainder in intelligence, he ordered. Strength, 330/335. Dexterity, 660/666. Intelligence, 263/265. Available stat points, 13/0. He looked around Nelil's Espada Palace to find the Trebisches all relaxing there. What did I miss? He asked. Sung Sun smiled and waved him over to the couch. Oh hey, welcome back. Harel-sama is getting the chance to become an Arrancar, she said. He raised his brow. This is both good and bad. They succeeding in their original transformation into Arrancar. They're even more powerful now before transforming, so I doubt they would fail. That doesn't mean nobody would interfere though, he thought. He sat down on the couch with Sung Sun. And when is this supposed to happen? He asked. Sung Sun smirked. Why are you sitting so far away? She asked with a teasing tone. He rolled his eyes. She laid her head in his lap, which he simply ignored. So are you going to answer me? He asked. She chuckled. Right. She said they told her to be ready in a few days. She went to prepare herself as well, she said. He nodded and looked over at Apache and Mila Rose. And what about the three of you? He asked. Mila Rose shrugged. I didn't think I'd be saying this, but it's a little boring here, she said. Apache shrugged. And the bird is still being annoying, she said. Sung Sun shrugs. She isn't that bad, she said. Apache shook her head. She is constantly making snide comments about Nelliel, Harel, and Hisashi. As if she could convince me to join her. It's really starting to get on my nerves, she said with a snort. Hisashi smirked. Ah. Are you standing up for my honor? I love you too, he said. Her face quickly turned red. Who fucking loves you? Only an idiot would. She retorted aggressively. Sung Sun laughed. Are you calling yourself an idiot? Maybe an idiot for love? She asked. Apache huffed in frustration, but decided to look away and just ignore her teasing. When he got up disturbing Sung Sun, she put on an exaggerated pout. Abandoning me already? She asked. He rolled his eyes. How could I ever abandon my sunny little Sung Sun? He said. She smirked. You better know it, she said. Apache glared at them. Could you two just shut up? She shouted. He dropped by Harel's room to find her on her bed. Eyes closed and with her legs crossed meditating. He leaned against the door frame watching her for a few moments. What are you up to? He eventually asked. She opened her eyes and smiled ever so slightly. Trying to get my mind calm. From what I've heard from those that already went through it, handling our instincts is a part of the transformation. Being agitated before going through it can't be good, she said. He nodded thoughtfully. He sat down beside her on the bed, covering both of them in his illusory aura, using it to make it look like they were just sitting together. Let me know when you leave to try it. I'll follow you while invisible and watch over you during, he whispered. She nodded and he dismissed the illusory aura. As he got up, Harel stretched her hand out to grab and stop him, but held back at the last moment. She sighed deeply after he left the room. Nelliel was lazing about in their room, laying lazily on their bed. He gulped. She didn't seem to realize how seductive she could be, barely wearing any clothes and the sheets only loosely covering her form. She jumped up as soon as she noticed him. You're back, she shouted excitedly. He smiled. She jumped up and tackled him into a tight hug. I missed you, she said. He chuckled. It was only a few weeks, he said. Although it still felt like a long time for him, it should be nothing but the blink of an eye to his hollow friends. The others barely even seemed to have noticed that he was gone for all that long. She firmly shook her head. No, it's far too long, she said. He smirked. Oh, did you miss me that much? He asked. She looked at him with a sincere look. When her eyes caught sight of the smirk on his lips, she blushed. She got on the tips of her toes, pulling him closer with her arms around his neck at the same time. Her face slowly nearing his until finally their lips met in a short peck. She quickly pulled back, her blush having spread all the way to her neck and ears. Are you convinced now? She asked nervously. He smiled, quickly lowering his lips to meet hers once again for a longer kiss. I missed you too, he whispered when they broke apart. 106 The Mantis. Harel looked at him nervously. She surprised him when she stepped forward and hugged him tightly. She breathed in deeply. He smiled softly. No need to worry. You'll be fine. I'm sure of it, he said. To give himself an alibi, he took a mission and left a few hours before she would go through the process. After getting far enough from Los Noches for his comfort, he used his illusory aura to turn invisible and returned to Harel's room in time to join her. Menali was the one that came to pick Harel up and guided her through Los Noches' many hallways. She didn't even have a clue Hisashi was following them. Between his illusory aura perfectly hiding him visually, his silencioso muffling all sound he generated, and spirit power concealment completely hiding his spiritual pressure signature, it was virtually impossible to notice him unless you came into physical contact with him. Between Menely and Harel, neither of which were the talkative type, it was a very quiet journey through the bowels of Los Noches until they reached the lab that was prepared for Harel's transformation. The laboratory was rather bare. A flight of stairs led down into the room which followed in the usual design principles that guided Los Noches. White walls and white tiled floors. Menely looked at Harel. "Someone will come to start soon," she said. She left as soon as her task was completed. Harel looked around for a few moments before leaning against a wall. He saw she tried looking around the laboratory seeing if he could find the Hogyoku. Given that he had seen it present when used to transform a hollow in the series, he was hoping he could again. However, he didn't seem to have such luck. Aizen just leaving it laying around would indeed be too convenient, I guess, he thought. It took a while, but eventually Cielaparo Grands showed up wearing his fake smile. "Ah, good. You're already here. Aizen-sama asked me to get things ready," he said. Harel looked over neutrally and simply nodded. "Please come over to the center of the room and assume a comfortable position," he instructed. Harel sat down as instructed and assumed a meditative pose with crossed legs. He saw she walked over to stand not far from her. "As part of the process, you'll be tied with sealing bandages. Once they're applied, you won't be able to move until the process is over. Is there anything you need to do before we apply them?" he asked. She shook her head. "Good. Then let's get started," he said. He activated some kind of mechanism and clear white bandages shot out from gaps in the floor, wrapping around Harel, tightly sealing her body. After multiple layers, they had interwoven into a sort of pseudo-cocoon vaguely shaped like her. Cielaparo stood by waiting patiently. When the sealing process completed, he let out an evil chuckle. "You must be feeling so proud of yourself. I can only imagine. After all, you came waltzing in all high and mighty. Invited by Aizen-sama himself even," he said. He sighed deeply. Letting Nelil go after crippling her was a mistake. We didn't foresee she would ever be able to recover. But here she is and all of you came along with her. It's only a matter of time before she outranks us again. Just a matter of time before we pay for our previous actions," he continued. He started slowly walking around her as he continued to talk. He seemed to enjoy hearing himself talk. Or maybe it was the knowledge he was inflicting mental anguish on someone. Most likely a little bit of both. It seems despite what happened, Nelil is still a fool though. Thinking we can't do anything about her. Her arrogance led to her fall once and it will again. All we need to do is weaken the new support she found. You aren't even a Arrancar yet. Taking care of you is easy. If it weren't for our desire to keep this from Aizen, we would have already taken care of you," he said. He saw she slowly approached him. Cielaparo looked her up and down and laughed. "Yet here you are. Willingly putting yourself in my hands," he said. He smirked. "I know you can still hear me. Too bad you can't do anything anymore," he said. He took out a syringe filled with an unknown deep red liquid. "You see. Now that you can't even defend yourself, just a little poison effective on hollow administered before you undergo the transformation, and everyone thinks you simply failed at becoming an Arrancar. That you were too garbage to become one even with the assistance of the Hogyoku, and soon after no one will remember you. We'll make sure of that by sending your friends after you soon enough," he said. He lifted the syringe up to eye level, tapped the glass to let the bubbles rise and pressed the stopper until a little bit of the liquid came out of the needle. He smiled venomously. "If there is one thing you can be thankful for is that it won't hurt." "Just kidding. It will hurt a lot and you won't even be able to scream. If you're unlucky, you might hold on until Aizen comes to start the process in over an hour. Just imagine suffering untold pain without even the relief of venting it by screaming for that long." "How delightful," he said. He casually walked up to her, ready to inject the poison and finish his task. Suddenly he felt a piercing pain in his chest. He looked down. He saw a stab wound on his chest leaking blood, but not the cause. He coughed. "Wah." He barely managed to mutter. Some blood leaked from his mouth. He struggled to turn his neck to look behind him, but surprisingly there was nothing there either. Before he realized it, he felt pain again, this time from his neck as his vision spun erratically. It wasn't until the last moment he realized he was dead, and he didn't even know who was responsible. 107 The Oriole. Plus 2,343,276 XP. Plus 114,840 spirit power. Level up. Plus 1 free stat point. Level up. +1 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 free stat point. XP 213,247/457,530. Spirit power 5,464,912. Hisashi was focusing on quickly absorbing all of Cielaparo's body to remove any evidence of what happened. Good thing I didn't trust these bastards. I knew my presence might change some things. We need to continue keeping our guard up. Few in Los Noches can be trusted. Cielaparo said, we meaning he isn't the only one involved with this plan. I'm sure Enoitra is involved too. They worked together to eliminate Neliel before, after all. It's safe to say their subordinates are involved, but the real question is whether any other factions are involved, he thought. Honestly, the only one he was certain wasn't involved were Grimmjow and his underlings, if only because of his massive pride wouldn't allow him to pursue such underhanded means. Such means were below him. As for anyone else that might be watching, due to the effect of illusory aura, it appeared like nothing had happened at all. He not only used it to hide himself, but once he reached close enough to Cielaparo for him to be within range of his ability, he controlled it to appear as if Cielaparo was just preparing to inject Harel with the poison. Once he had completely absorbed Cielaparo, he even went one step further and took his place by replacing his image with Cielaparo's and released a matching level of spiritual pressure. He knew Aizen probably wasn't always watching, but he or his underlings potentially could be watching at any time in Los Noches. He continued to act as if he were Cielaparo and acted like he was injecting Harel with a syringe he wasn't actually holding. He left shortly after. Though Aizen and others probably wouldn't show up for a little longer, he didn't want to take any risks. Similar to what he had done once already, he once again left Los Noches and returned after turning invisible once he was convinced he was outside of Los Noches' sphere of influence. Man, this is annoying. I can't take any risks though, he thought, walking back towards the lab Harel was in while maintaining his invisibility. He actually had to patiently wait outside the door to the lab, as the door was shut and it opening for no one would be rather suspicious. All he could hope was that no one had shown up while he was gone and entered before him. Even if they did, the risk was rather low though. Even if they were in one of the factions that was looking to eliminate Neliel and anyone related to her, they would be convinced Cielaparo had already taken care of things. It took a while, but eventually Suruxi was actually the one to show up. He followed close behind her while the door remained open. They both looked around the lab as soon as they entered to find no one except the still cocooned Harel seated at the center of the room. Suruxi walked up to Harel, looking at her closely. After a few moments, she walked over the one of the bare white blocks off to the side and hopped up and sat on the edge of it, swinging her legs. She frowned, biting the nail on her thumb. Why won't they join me? Is it because of that bastard? He's just another Vasto lord. Now it won't just be Neliel, but she will have another strong Arrancar at her disposal. What should I do? She muttered to herself. Hisashi just shook his head. Not only did she do a bad job at actually enticing them because they were already about as strong as her even before transforming, but she also kept antagonizing him, who along with Harel acted like the leader of their little group, which of course wasn't going to garner her any goodwill with them. Maybe she truly was a bird brain. It didn't take much longer for more Espada to show up. Hisashi did his best to limit his movement and any sound he might make. Since his ability reduced the sound he generated by percentage, the less he created in the first place, the more silent the end result was after all. First was Neliel, who was eager to see Harel join her as an Arrancar. As soon as she walked in, a flash of annoyance passed through Suruxi's gaze. Although she could dream of Neliel joining her, she knew that would never happen, so her presence could only annoy her, as she took everything she felt belonged to herself. Whether it was that she was more powerful, the allies she managed to find, or simply the appearance she was secretly somewhat jealous of, it seemed she had everything Suruxi felt she herself deserved to have. Then Ulquira and Aroniro showed up shortly after one another, but neither said anything from the moment they entered, simply finding a spot and watching on silently. Enoitra came in and looked around and seemed to frown, probably due to Cielaparo not being present. He didn't say anything either though. He likely expected things were done and would be going his way soon enough. Coyote just nodded at them to acknowledge them upon entering. Finally Grimmjow strode in like he owned the place. He had also become an Espada. It seemed Neliel showing up after him and becoming an Espada before him, even if she had been one before already, had motivated him. He had actually managed to challenge and defeat Dordani. His win was much harder to achieve, which just seemed to frustrate him further. He looked at Neliel with arrogance and challenge in his eyes. He actually wasn't that interested in her, but more Hisashi, who was part of her fraction. He had never been defeated by Neliel after all, even if it was just because they had never actually had a real fight. He didn't care though. He would retrieve his wounded ego. Becoming an espada was just the first step. He walked over to her and narrowed his eyes. He continued to look her in the eyes with arrogance. "Where's the bug?" he asked. Neliel frowned in annoyance. "Who?" she said. "You know who I mean." "The forearms," he retorted. She shook her head. "He is on a mission outside Los Noches," she finally said. She didn't intend to elaborate any further. Grimmjow eventually snorted and walked off to find somewhere to sit lazily. 108 The cicada sheds its carapace. Hisashi slowly made his way towards the corner of the room furthest from Harel and the door. He was relatively confident in his myriad abilities to keep himself hidden. He also wanted to do his best to protect Harel, but with Cielaparo already trying to take action, the risk to Harel was currently likely the lowest it would ever be. Deep down he was also worried that somehow Aizen might still be able to notice him. A little while later, Aizen calmly waltzed into the room. It didn't look like any of the other espada were going to appear. Maybe some of them were out doing missions or busy with other things. Hisashi doubted many wouldn't show up if called upon by Aizen. Aizen looked around the room while walking up to Harel's cocoon. "Thank you all for coming to the awakening of another of our brethren," he said. When he reached in front of her, he must have done something, because a translucent square barrier appeared around her form. Aizen took out a small pearl-like object shimmering with blue and purple and placed it on a space on the barrier. Hisashi looked at the Hogyoku with desire, but knew he couldn't do anything at the moment. He wasn't even sure about taking on Aizen by himself right now, let alone with multiple espada backing him up. He hadn't fought any of the espada for him to be sure, but ignoring the weakest ones, he would struggle to deal with one of the stronger ones in a one-on-one, let alone if they ganged up on him. When Aizen let go the Hogyoku, it remained there floating mid-air. He smiled. "Well, let's get started then. Shall we?" he said. He stretched his hand towards the Hogyoku while letting loose his captain-level spirit power. The Hogyoku turned pitch black and small black tendrils stretched out towards Aizen's finger. The moment they connected, an even heavier pressure escaped the Hogyoku, causing a stir in the air. The pressure seemed to redirect towards Harel's cocooned form. After a few moments, the barrier surrounding her shattered into pieces and her cocoon of bandages followed moments after revealing her new form. As soon as she escaped her bindings, another wave of pressure passed over them, this time originating from Harel. The bone-like hollow mask material that armored her body and formed a large blade on her right arm had disappeared. The only part that remained were the parts covering the lower half of her face with a shark-like jaw, which had become even more detailed, and down her chest covering the upper part of her breasts. Her golden locks that only came down to her ears before now fell all the way down to the middle of her back. The only things on here were a sheath and zanpakuto in the form of a short sword held in each hand. The core of the zanpakuto's blade was empty, leaving only the sharp edge, guard, and hilt, which had a katana-style purple silk wrap on it. She stood up, revealing her full form, and looked at herself without saying anything. She finally settled on her sword. She nodded to herself, seeming satisfied with what she saw. She carefully sheathed her zanpakuto and looked around the room. Hisashi couldn't help but be a little mesmerized. Aside from the few pieces of mask remaining, she was completely in the nude after the transformation. None of the others seemed to pay it mind, but he still had most of his human consciousness and was going on a 3-decade-long dry spell. The stimulation was a little too strong for him. In the end, it only further stimulated his desire to regain his human form. Aizen had taken so much from him. His family. His friends. His happiness. His future. He was slowly clawing them back one by one, and he would continue to do so. Hisashi smirked, noticing Enoitra's trembling fist and intent glare at Harel. It was clear he was barely able to contain his stirring emotions after it became obvious their plan had failed. Grimmjow seemed equally agitated for entirely different reasons. Aizen smiled at Harel. "How do you feel, new comrade?" he asked. She clenched and released her fist. "Good," she said. He nodded and turned to walk away. "Everything seems to be in order. Menali is waiting outside. When you're ready she will take you to receive some clothing. You can put in an order for something more to your liking, he said. Once he left the others started moving. Ulquiorra left like he had arrived, without saying anything. Aroniro gave her a curious look, but also left without approaching her. Grimmjow sneered, but didn't say anything as he left first. Coyote gave her a respectful nod, but didn't approach her and left instead. Suruxi went up with her with an excited smile. Congratulations on finally becoming one of us. Got any plans for celebrating? She asked. Her smile seemed somewhat wooden though. Harel shrugged lightly. Probably spend it with the others, she said. Hisashi could see Suruxi's smile grow more strained moment by moment. She did her best to keep her expression positive. Well, let me know if you need anything, she eventually forced out before quickly leaving, likely to not blow up on Harel on the spot and ruin what little chance she thought she had. Enoitra just stood there the whole time, unable to decide what to do, but even he left, eventually leaving Harel alone. Harel looked around the empty room, but eventually shook her head and left. Even after leaving she wasn't able to notice Hisashi as he left the room, following closely after her. Menali was indeed outside waiting for her. She gave a short polite bow to Harel, who was now ranked no lower than herself. Follow me, she said. It seemed. She didn't intend to say more as they passed through the halls of Los Noches once again to take care of Harel's apparel. They gave her a basic outfit that looked like an inverted white version of the Shinigami's Shiakusha. She did end up ordering an outfit very similar to what he was familiar with from the series. Once he made sure she made it back to Neliel's palace he sighed in relief. Now to actually go do my missions I'm supposed to be on, he thought, walking out of Los Noches for a final time unseen by anyone. 109 Fabricating an alibi. Hisashi actually took his time completing the mission rather than his usual rushing. It would be better not to return too soon after killing Ciel Aparo. Whether it was just from an alibi standpoint or in case there was some way for Aizen to detect any traces on him from what he had done. The more time he spent away from Los Noches and killing and consuming other hollows, the less likely any suspicion, let alone detection, would be. He didn't return until over a week later after taking the scenic route and consuming as many Jillian and Ajuches as were unfortunate enough to come across his path. None were spared. The first to notice his return was Neliel, who didn't hesitate to get the attention she wanted from him. However, for once surprisingly, Harel followed not far behind her. He gently patted Neliel's head to her satisfaction. You were gone too long, she mumbled. Harel hesitated for a moment, but eventually came forwards and hugged him despite her hesitation. Thank you, she said. Though it was only 2 words, he could tell the amount of feelings she was trying to convey in them. He smiled. Anytime, he said. She nodded shyly and quickly broke away. She coughed awkwardly. How was your mission? She asked to change the subject. It wasn't too bad. You know how it goes. They were arrogant at first. Nothing killing a few of the most arrogant couldn't solve, he said. She nodded. More importantly, how have you been feeling since your transformation? He asked. Much better. I feel more powerful, yet more in control of both my power and urges, she said. That makes sense. You are effectively less a hollow now. Though your urges will likely never be completely gone, becoming an Arrancar should have had a significant effect on your mind and instincts, even more so than your body itself, he said. His gaze hardened a little. Have there been any problems while I was gone? He asked. She shook her head. Since the transformation it has been quiet, she said. Sung Sun came out to greet him too. Too quiet. Welcome back, Jack, she said teasingly. Okay, as much as I appreciate all the attention, let's get out of the hallway, he said. Neliel and Harel actually blushed. Neliel actually refused to let go. Sung Sun giggled. Well, aren't you proud of yourself? She asked. He smirked. Are you saying I shouldn't be? He asked. She rolled her eyes. You're being no fun, she said. She turned and headed back towards their living room. The 3 of them followed after her. Neliel kept clinging to his side as if he would abandon her the moment she let go of him. He shook his head with a smile. They found Apaxi, Mila Rose, Dondakaka and Pest were already relaxing in the living room. Apaxi was sprawled out on the couch. She looked over at Hisashi, but didn't get up. Oh, you're finally back? She asked. He lifted his foot and pushed her off the couch with it. Hey, you bastard. I'll kick your ass, she shouted while rubbing her sore ass. He deadpanned at her. Oh, have you gotten stronger than me yet? he asked. She frowned. Just wait until I become an Arrancar. I dare you to fight me then, she said. Sung Sun hid her giggle behind her sleeve. Can you get any more shameless, Apaxi-chan? She asked. Apaxi turned even redder from embarrassment. He sat down on a couch and Neliel hopped onto the couch beside him with an excited smile. Meanwhile the others found a place to sit. So what has been going on while I was gone? He asked. Neliel smiled. I'll go first, she said excitedly. He saw she looked at her curiously. Rather than answering though, she looked over to Pesach. After a while of silence she said, well, tell them what's been going on. He saw she sighed. As the espada leading us, aren't you supposed to be the one that knows what's going on? He asked. She giggled awkwardly in response. But I'm not good at it. Pesach is much better at it, she said. Pesach stood up. He looked serious, but if you paid closer attention you could see his legs shaking. Due to Enoitra crippling them, they were rather weak compared to the rest, even though some of them weren't even Arrancar yet. We've gotten our faction established. Having another Arrancar they have to take serious has helped cement Neliel's position. We are currently getting approved for the next one of us to use the Hogyoku will take a little longer as there is a waiting list. It also seems some of the other factions might be intentionally working to delay us on that, though I wasn't able to find out exactly which ones as they have made sure to hide their tracks, he said. Hisashi nodded. Well, once we get out allotment let's have Apaxi use our next slot, he said. Apaxi's eyes widened in surprise. A-, are you sure? She asked nervously. He smirked. Yeah, I've got to kick you ass while I'm still a Vasta Lord so you can understand I'm better than you, he said. She crossed her arms and looked away with a miffed expression. She didn't turn down the offer though. She might be easily agitated, but she wasn't that stupid. Sung Sun smiled, pressing her breasts together between her arms as she leaned forward. Ah. How could you pass me up? She asked with an exaggerated pout. Mila Rose pushed her. I'm calling second, she said. Sung Sun turned to glare at her. Hey, that's not allowed, she said. Hisashi chuckled. Well, glad that you managed to settle that with each other, he said. Mila Rose nodded. Who said it was settled? Sung Sun asked indignantly. He shrugged. If you can't figure it out between each other, he said. Mila Rose glared at Sung Sun as if daring her to. Pest wasn't sure what to do while the rest of them just ignored the three girls. They would figure it out eventually. 110 The Bount. Karakura Town, Urahara Shop, August 22nd. Raina and Masaki were in Urahara's living room, but they weren't alone. Everyone had packed into the little room. Ichigo, Inoue, Chad, Urahara, Ishida, Renji, Yuru, Jinta and Tessai were sitting at the table with them. Behind Urahara were his three modified souls he had used to trick Ichigo and his friends. Ryren, a short blonde-haired and blue-eyed girl. Kurido, an older mustachioed man wearing glasses. His long hair was parted down the middle with one half being black and the other being blonde. Noba, a young man wearing a fur coat that had a zippered hood. The only part of him that were visible were his green eyes and a few fringes of his red hair that escaped the hood. Sitting beside Urahara was an unknown hot woman with purple hair and chocolate skin. The atmosphere was tense. Raina kept staring at the beautiful woman with the purple hair. Is that really Yorichi? She asked in amazement. Yorichi smirked and emphasized her assets. What? Don't you recognize me? She asked. Raina shook her head. So not only aren't you a cat, you're not even male? She asked. Yorichi chuckled. Not at all, she said. You're taking this awfully easy, Masaki said. Raina sighed. Am I supposed to keep freaking out every time something crazy happens? She asked. Masaki shrugged. I guess you have a point, she said. For once even Urahara looked serious. So the Bount, he said. Bount? Ishida questioned. Urahara pulled out a vial filled with some purple fluid. These spirit particles are probably from a Bount, he said. So what's a Bount? Ichigo asked impatiently. Urahara looked over at Yorichi, who nodded back. It seemed they had come to some sort of agreement. When I was in the Department of Research and Development I saw residue that looked a lot like this. It's a mysterious spirit particle that reacts with special components of human souls. Upon investigation, I found a tribe called the Bount, Urahara said. A tribe? Ishida asked. They are few in number, but the Bount are humans who have special powers like the Quincy. Quincy's, having the power to destroy hollows, brought disaster upon themselves, but Bounts absorb human souls as nourishment. Also, Quincy's are born human and die human, but by absorbing human souls, Bounts can live forever. That's all I found out, but I have never been able to see one myself. Urahara explained. Live forever minus. Ichigo asked. Yes. Bounts gain eternal life by absorbing human souls for food. That's the kind of tribe they are. It seems that depending on the era and place they were also called vampires, Urahara said. The way Bounts usually do things is to come and steal the soul of a human who died while Kanso is being performed on it. But this time the Bount I saw was trying to absorb the soul of a living person, Yorichi said. What happens to people if their souls are sucked out? Ichigo asked. The same thing as when their lives are taken. The result is, in other words, death, Urahara said. Death? Inoue asked. Yorichi turned to Urahara. We're still not sure if it's a Bount. Do you suppose that it could be a subspecies of Bount? She asked. Well, who knows? Urahara said. Why are you crossing your arms and thinking so hard? At this rate, there may be more victims. Ichigo said angrily. All right. Just as I expected of you, Kurosaki. You sure have a strong sense of justice. Urahara retorted. Ichigo frowned. Cut the sarcasm, he said. So anyway, Rairin. Urahara said. Rairin looked surprised. Huh? She said. Go to Kurosaki's place, Urahara said. What? No way. She retorted. Huh? What are you talking about? Ichigo asked. Kurosaki, Inoue, and Sato will act as support, Urahara said. Support? Inoue questioned. Urahara pointed at Rairin, Nobu and Kurido. These three mod souls have spirit particle sensor functions attached, he said. Sensors? Inoue asked. They can detect spirit particle waves. In other words, the enemy is targeting living humans. All of you have exceptionally high abilities for humans. You would be tempting prey for them. We're not sure if they'll notice you. We have to find the location of the enemy quickly, Urahara explained. I see. What? Huh? Then what about me? Ishida said. Oh, it's as I just said. Urahara said awkwardly. You don't have any abilities. Rairin bluntly completed it for him. Ishida looked like he had taken a direct hit. Ichigo patted Ishida on the shoulder to console him. That's right, isn't it? He said. Now then. So Kurido will go to Inu's place, Urahara said. Noba, go to Sato's place, Urahara said. Rairin looked at Ichigo. Well, I guess it can't be helped. But don't give me too much trouble. Rairin said. Ichigo glared back at her. What did you say? You're causing me trouble. He shouted. Oh. I forget, who couldn't defend against my attack. Come on, say it. Rairin responded gloatingly. You never shut up. Ichigo muttered. Masaki glared at Ichigo, quickly causing him to go silent. Is that how you talk to a lady? She asked. Rairin crossed her arms and looked at Ichigo with a smug look. Masaki turned to face her unamused, causing her to deflate rather quickly. Also, you may already know, I want you to hide yourselves in stuffed animals, Urahara told the three modified souls. Stuffed animals? Kurido questioned. Are you serious? Rairin asked. Masaki looked over at Raina. You and me are both possible targets too due to our high spirit power. How about you stay at our place until this blows over? I wouldn't mind some extra protection for my daughters either, she said. Ichigo frowned. Daughters? What about your son? He asked. Masaki smacked his head. Are you saying you're so weak you need to be protected by her? Are you intentionally trying to embarrass me? She asked. I get it. He mumbled in annoyance. 111 Quter to Wo Mundo? Karakura Town, Kurosaki Clinic. Raina noticed Ichigo in his Shinigami form carrying a little plush bird in a blue dress running away from the house. She looked over at Masaki. Your son seems to be going somewhere. What are you planning to do? She asked. Masaki sighed and shook her head. This stupid boy always running off by himself half-cocked, she said. So are we just going to let him go like that? Raina asked. No, but he does need to learn for himself. Let's follow him from a distance, Masaki said. They both transformed. Raina taking on the sorcerer-like appearance while Masaki turned into her hollow Quincy Nicktig form. They chased Ichigo from far enough to where neither he or anyone he engaged with would be able to easily detect them. Ichigo eventually ran into a beautiful woman with long brown hair and wearing bright red lipstick attacking a regular human. He attacked her, but in response she summoned some kind of golem made out of fire. Ichigo was struggling as the golem seemed to be impervious to physical attacks. Every time Ichigo cut it with his Zanpakuto, it would simply reform to its normal shape completely unharmed. Ichigo got caught off guard due to his overconfidence, ending up sent flying into a building and trapped in the resulting rubble. The Folem was about to send a finishing move with 2 giant spheres of fire his way while he was unable to escape. Raina looked at Masaki worriedly. "Should we interfere?" she asked. Masaki shook her head and smiled. She pointed up. "No need," she said. A bolt of lightning came crashing down onto the golem's attack, dispersing it. When the lightning and fire cleared, a figure became visible at the point of collision surrounded by the remnant flames. It was a short black-haired woman with an unimpressive figure. It was Ichigo's friend and the person to turn him into a Shinigami. "Kuchiki Rukia. What are you doing, fool?" she scolded him. She looked back at him. "Have you gotten rusty, Ichigo?" she asked. Ichigo dug himself out of the debris he was trapped under. "Rukia!" he yelled. "More, Gerta. Destroy them!" the brunette yelled. The golem was about to attack them when a bunch of snakes wrapped around it to restrict it and causing it to disperse entirely. Afterwards the snakes turned into metal pipes that fell to the ground with a clatter. A middle-aged man appeared and kidnapped the brunette women right from under their noses. Moments after they disappeared, Inoue and Chad showed up. It turned out the mysterious man was a Bount they had been tracking after he attacked a human. They became elated when they noticed Rukia. This was the first time they saw her since leaving Soul Society. "Okay. It seems the danger is gone. Let's head back home," Masaki said. Raina looked disappointed. "What?" "But it was just getting good," she said. Masaki shook her head. "Let's leave these kids to their own devices," she said. The two of them quickly headed back before Ichigo could make it home to avoid suspicion. Karakura Town, Urahara Store, August 23rd. Raina and Masaki came to the Urahara store again after they received a call. Apparently Ichigo and his friends had another run-in with the male Bount, and during the fight Ishida had been kidnapped by the brunette Bount woman who showed up unexpectedly. By the time they arrived, Ichigo and his friends had already returned. They were all sitting around the table silently while feeling sorry for themselves. Ichigo was impatient to search all of Karakura Town to find Ishida, but Urahara stopped him. "Where are you planning to go? You have a destination in mind?" "Urahara. If we split up, we can find him," Ichigo said. "Don't do it. We don't know their objective. Maybe, like he did the other day, he might come after whoever is alone. The doll that Bount manipulates seems to have mysterious powers that exceed those of our Zanpakuto. If you go after them without a good plan, you'll be falling right into enemy hands," Urahara said. He managed to calm them down and get them to sit back down. "I've been debating whether or not to tell you this. The reason we thought of researching Bounts is because there was a special substance contained in the residue. In small quantities, that substance poses no problems, but in increasing quantities, there's a good chance it could affect space," Urahara said. "Won't you explain it in more detail?" Rukia asked. "In other words, it becomes possible to connect this world with Wo Mundo, the narrow world in which the hollows dwell," Urahara said. "If that happens, many living beings will be sucked into Wo Mundo," Rukia said. Raina's eyes widened. "Would anyone be able to use that corridor?" she asked eagerly. Some of them looked confused about her excitement, while others had a sympathetic gaze. Not everyone knew the situation regarding her brother. Masaki shook her head. "You know Hisashi wouldn't want that. Who even knows where you would land? What if you end up on the opposite side of Wo Mundo? What if you come across a powerful hollow?" she asked. Urahara nodded seriously. "There are hollow in Wo Mundo far more powerful than any you've encountered on Earth," he said. Raina bit her lip out of frustration. "But," she said quietly, "you have to have faith in him. He will be back before you know it," Masaki said, trying to reassure her. Raina sighed, but dropped the thought of making use of the Bount to travel to Wo Mundo. Also, Soul Society has been using the time it takes for a hollow to appear in this world to base how they station the Soul Reapers. If the hollows are able to easily get from there to here," Urahara said, They could call out every single Soul Reaper and we still wouldn't be able to handle them. Renji completed. Yes. For the Hollows, it would probably be a soul-eating free-for-all. Of course, this is just a possibility, you understand, Urahara said. How much of a possibility? Chad asked. Urahara held up 5 fingers. I'd say. About this much, he said. 5%. Ichigo asked. Don't joke. Urahara said. Rukia pushed him aside. You mean, 50%? She asked. Urahara nodded, shocking everyone present. Tessai opened the door to the tea room. We've received word from Ishida. He said. 112 getting away with murder. Wo Mundo, Los Noches. Almost 3 months had passed since Hisashi had killed Ciel. It took a while before anyone even figured out he might be dead. At first, when they thought he was missing, they tried tracking him down and found that according to the records he had left Los Noches on his own after he finished helping Harel. This delayed any further investigation as they simply awaited his return. Eventually they had to concede he might not be coming back and had either left or found trouble elsewhere and was unable to return or possibly even dead. Though there were some investigations at first, but beyond Ciel's Frakian no one really cared all that much, leading to a lackluster effort. Maybe Aizen did care to some extent, but it was hard to tell exactly how much. Hisashi knew it couldn't be too much though, given how he ended up treated any Arrancar that failed to live up to his expectations. Hisashi was sure dying would be considered failing to live up to his expectations. There was more of an upheaval regarding Ciel's position as an Espada than about his disappearance itself. Someone had to take over his position after all, and there were plenty of Arrancar interested in taking it for themselves. Since none of Hisashi's group stepped up to fight for the spot, it was actually taken up by a familiar face. At least to Hisashi. It was an effeminate-looking male Arrancar with short black hair, lavender eyes, and a mask fragment in his hair that looked like a hairpin. He wore the standard Arrancar clothing customized with long sleeves and cutouts over his sides. Loopy antennae. Despite not being part of Hisashi's plan, it seemed Suruxi was actually in luck, as Ciel's death would seem to have extended her stay as part of the Espada. As long as none of the others in Hisashi's little group decided to challenge her for her spot. He doubted she would be very thankful even if she knew about it though. He pulled up the progress report in his system. Plus 9 weeks to H. Plus 7,029,828 XP from HALLOW. Plus 344,520 spirit power from HALLOW. Plus 277,337 spirit power from spiritual energy absorption. Plus 14 levels. Plus 14 stat points. Status panel. Name, Saito Hisashi. Soul age, 59. Race, HALLOW. Rank, Vasto Lord. Level, 295/309. XP, 108,914/478,950. Stats. Strength, 335. Dexterity, 666. Constitution, 175. Intelligence, 265. Spirit power, 5,204,678/5,826,535. Available stat points, 0/14. Passive skills. Spiritual energy absorption. Ultra speed regeneration. Acidic touch. Silencioso. Active skills. Soul body separation. Spirit power concealment. Illusory aura. Blute. Energy blade. Transcribe. Hachijio Sogai. Sero. Kumin. Negation. Skill infusion. Sonido. Karinzanjutsu. Active missions. New mission, allow the system to absorb the Hagyoku. Reward, evolution into a perfect Arrancar, giving the host the best offered by being HALLOW and Shinigami. Go ahead and put 9 points in dexterity and the rest into strength, he ordered. Strength, 335/340. Dexterity, 666/675. Available stat points, 14/0. He felt just a little bit satisfied seeing rounded numbers in all his stats. Was that some minor form of OCD or just the nature of an RPG gamer? He wasn't sure. He sighed. He could barely even notice the change when adding stat points anymore. He was sure they were still working as the system had never lied to him before, but even if he were to save up 100 points and invest them all at once, that would still be an increase of less than 10% to his total stat values. When splitting so few points over multiple stats, it was barely even a percent change to any one of them. He could only reminisce about his early days as a hollow, where a single point took mere days to earn and made a world of difference. He had to remind himself of how dangerous it was to do so too. Unless he miraculously ran into a captain-class Shinigami in Wo Mundo, he was pretty much safe at all times. As for the snakes amongst the espada, he had already taken care of Cielaparo, and though Enoitra could cause him some grief, he believed so long as it was just Enoitra and he didn't have any other allies on the espada, he could still make it out alive. He had returned because once again their turn to use the Hogyoku again. This time it was Apache's chance. Now that Cielaparo was gone, the odds of something being done to them while they were vulnerable was far lower, but he wasn't going to leave it to chance, as Enoitra was still around and he didn't know if there were any other Arrancar on his side. Not to mention that he didn't trust Aizen whatsoever. He gently patted the top of Nelliel's head to get her attention. "It's time to get up. Today is Apache's big day," he said. Nelliel stirred lightly, her eyes opened and she looked up at him. Good morning," she mumbled. He chuckled watching her. It wasn't like they actually needed sleep. She just liked relaxing with him, and it was cute to see her like that anyway. They headed to the living area just to find Apache pacing there already. He saw she smirked. "Oh. Nervous already are we?" he teased. Apache turned red. "Who's nervous?" "Your face is nervous," she yelled. He laughed out loud. "That doesn't even make any sense," he said. Harel joined them. "Stop teasing her. She's got enough on her mind as is," she admonished him. Apache shot her a grateful look, though he saw she wouldn't notice. Harel smiled. "So are you all ready?" she asked. Apache gave a determined nod. "She'll be fine," he saw she said. Apache looked away to hide her embarrassment. "Shut up," she mumbled. Mila Rose and Sung Sun came from their bedrooms together. Sung Sun yawned lazily and looked around the room. "Is it time already?" she asked. Her lazy expression was quickly replaced with a smirk. "Are you ready to get beaten again after becoming an Arrancar?" she asked teasingly. "I'm not gonna lose. I'm gonna kick his ass," Apache retorted aggressively. 113 The unicorn horn remains. Despite the hassle, Hisashi repeated his actions from the previous time, making it seem he had left on a missions while secretly following Apache while invisible the day of her transformation. This time it was actually Loli that picked up and guided Apache. This turned out to be the worst matchup possible. Unlike Harel and Menli, who were both the more silent type, these two were both stubborn loud mouths with a feather trigger. Loli looked back at Apache with disdain. "Alright, stop wasting my time and get a move on, shorty," she said. Apache glared back at her. "If you don't shut up real quick, I'm going to show you the difference between a Vasto Lord and a measly Ajuches," she said. Loli's disdainful look quickly turned into a glare too. "Bitch. You aren't even an Arrancar yet. Who do you think you're talking to?" she spat back. Hisashi could only shake his head and take a few steps distance in case things turned explosive. Apache snorted. "Want to bet? I could kick your ass any day even without becoming an Arrancar." "You're just that pathetic," she said. Loli gritted her teeth. "If it wasn't for Aizen-sama ordering me to guide you, I would have made you pay for that," she said. Apache smirked victoriously. Apache was lead to the same lab Harel had been. The process went quite similarly even without Cielaparo's presence. A different Arrancar Hisashi wasn't familiar with took over the task of prepping Apache for the transformation. Hisashi was relieved to see there were no attempts to interfere this time. After the bandage seals were applied, the other Arrancar left and it took a while for the available espada to file in. Hisashi took a closer look at Enoitra when he arrived. He didn't look to be too amused by the situation. Hisashi had to wonder how much longer Enoitra would be able to hold back before making another attempt against them. He had been laying low after what happened with Cielaparo. Even if there was no proof that Nelliel's group was involved with Cielaparo's disappearance, he had gone missing right after trying to harm Harel. Of course he would have his suspicions. Unfortunately, without proof there is nothing he could do, and he wasn't going to admit to attempting to harm one of their new comrades during their transformation. The idea that they might have been able to make him disappear without a trace of it scared him more than a little. Enoitra's gaze traveled towards Nelliel, but quickly looked away nervously. Eventually Aizen walked in again and activated the translucent barrier and placed the Hogyoku in it. After infusing it with his spirit power, it activated and the barrier and bandage cocoon around Apache broke into shards, unveiling her brand new body. She had short black hair and after losing her equine head could finally truly scowl like she was always meant to. The only part of her mask that remained was a horn at the center of her forehead and a ridge over the top of her head. The only thing she was wearing after completing her transformation were 2 white bangles, one on each wrist, which were actually her zanpakuto. She crossed her arms and puffed her still unimpressive chest while laughing out loud. "Just wait. I'll crush you this time," she said mostly to herself. Hisashi shook his head. He was fairly certain he knew exactly who she was talking about. Aizen wore his usual smile. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Great," she said excitedly. Aizen took back the Hagyoku. "Good. Loli will take care of things from here on out," he said and left. Apache looked around the room and smiled when she saw Nellil. "Hey Nell. Let's go get my clothing together," she said. Nellil simply nodded. Hisashi carefully followed them, making sure none of the espadas still in the room noticed him. Apache smirked at Loli, who was waiting just outside the room. She unleashed her new spirit pressure that was at least twice what it had been that morning. "Still got anything to say, shrimp?" she asked provocatively. Loli chewed her lip and seemed to be weighing things. Eventually she just turned away and started walking. "Follow me," she said. It took her and Nellil a while to decide on what kind of clothes to order for her. It would take a couple days for them to be custom made to her desires. When they finally got to their palace, she yelled out, "Hey Jack. Where are you?" He smirked, but slipped out as he still needed to complete his deception, as if he had been outside of Los Noches on a mission for this duration. Since he didn't have to act like he was on a difficult mission to distract from his possible involvement in the disappearance of an espada, he took only a few days to return. As soon as he entered their living area, Apache sprang up. "What took you so long?" she almost growled out in annoyance. Sung Sun giggled. "Oh, she missed you so much while you were gone. All that heartache and no outlet," she said. Apache glared at her. "Shut up, Sung Sun," she said through gritted teeth. It only made Sung Sun laugh harder though. Apache's glare quickly shifted back to Hisashi. "Now it's time for you to keep our agreement." "Time for me to kick your ass," she said with a malicious smirk. Hisashi rolled his eyes. "I can't reveal too much of my power inside of Los Noches," he thought. He looked around at the other girls that were there. "How about we make it an outing? It'll be like the good old days," he said. Apache snorted. "What good old days? You mean when it was just Mila Rose, Sung Sun, me and Haribel-sama?" she retorted. Haribel smiled. "That sounds like fun. I haven't seen Apache this excited in quite a while," she said. Apache frowned, but held back from arguing with Haribel. Mila Rose laughed, seeing her look like she swallowed a fly. "What? Cat got your tongue?" she asked. Nellil jumped up excitedly. "I want to go too," she said. "Don't forget about us." "Don'tcha know?" Dondakaka said, worried. Pesch nodded furiously in agreement. "We also haven't had as much time to play with Bawa. It would be nice to let him out to play too," he said. 114 Sandy Mila Rose. Somewhere in Wo Mundo. Wo Mundo's pale sandy dunes stretched as far as the eye could see. Bawa was excitedly slithering across it at high speed, with everyone else relaxing on his back. They were searching for a good spot to hold the duel. Although it might be possible someone might follow them, but if they held the duel inside Los Noches and he were to show enough power to match Apache now that she was an Arrancar, it was guaranteed to draw attention. Not only that, but if anyone saw him going toe-to-toe with a Vasto Lord ranked Arrancar as a regular Vasto Lord, that would put even more attention on himself. That wasn't something he wanted any of the Arrancar outside of their little clique to be aware of. At least not for now. Hisashi was receiving an ever-intensifying glare from Apache. He was more distracted by Nellil, who had practically crawled into his lap with how close she was sitting to him though. Apache felt frustrated. Despite her becoming an Arrancar, he didn't even seem to be taking her as a serious contender. Eventually she lost her cool and jumped down from Bawa. "Here should be just fine," she said. Hisashi looked around. Since they were already quite a few hours away from Los Noches and he couldn't sense anyone anymore, he just shrugged. "Sure. Whatever you say," he said nonchalantly. She grit her teeth. "Just wait. I'll show you," she said. Hisashi rolled his eyes, but jumped off to join her. "Have fun, you two." Sung Sung shouted after them. Apache looked at him with a smirk and a predatory gaze. She swung her fist around as if warming up. I've been waiting for this moment for quite a while, she said. He saw she smirked. Just don't complain afterward, he said. She hopped up and down a few times before suddenly breaking into a dash towards him. She wore an excited, almost manic smile. He was easily able to keep up with her movements due to his ridiculous amount of dexterity. Although much faster than before, she still appeared slow to him. She cocked back her fist and swung recklessly. Take this, she shouted. Rather than dodge, he braced himself and crossed his arms in front of him, taking the blow directly. Although it was slightly risky, he wanted to see just how powerful she had managed to become. She actually managed to force him back, leaving 2 deep grooves in the sand. She didn't appear happy though. She grit her teeth. Oh yeah. How about this? She shouted as she spun around and kicked at him from the side. He used the force from her kick to launch himself back, landing further away from her with minimal harm. His smirk widened, seeing her growing frustration. Was that all? He asked. She glowered. You're asking for it, she retorted. She pulled of the bangles from her wrists, which quickly increased in size and grew dangerous-looking spikes. It may be an unusual form, but it was her Zanpakuto, which meant it was a lot more dangerous than her hand-to-hand combat skills. With 2 sharp weapons, she quickly turned into a little whirlwind of sharp blades. It didn't take him long to realize he would need to take her a little more serious, as her Zanpakuto was actually able to break through his armor, leaving cuts across it. None of them were too serious, but considering she couldn't even break his skin before, it was a large improvement. Excited about her success, her smirk widened. Her attacks became even wilder than they had already been. The only things that were able to resist her blows were his blades, which were likely the hardest part of his body. Struggling, are you? I can keep this up all day, she said arrogantly between her attacks. He saw she raised his brow. A smirk broke out on his lips. She suddenly jumped back, looking at him warily. Since you've had your fun, how about we turn this up a notch? He asked. Apache went right back to being annoyed after realizing he had scared her off with nothing more than a smirk. Keep acting tough. I just need to slowly tear you to pieces, she said, regaining some of her confidence. She dashed back at him again to resume her flurry of attacks. He shook his head as if disappointed. Unlike before, he stopped trying to block, instead using his dexterity to dodge every one of her attacks by a hair's breadth. No energy wasted. The calm smirk on his lips only added to her frustration, and her attacks grew wilder and wilder. This only made it easier for him to dodge them and wasted more of her energy on attacks that were never going to land. He saw she suddenly disappeared from her sight. What? She yelled. Smack. Apache turned bright red in anger and embarrassment. He was standing right behind her. He had slapped her ass again. Even after becoming an Arrancar, she still couldn't make him serious. She glared back at him. Bastard, she shouted. A red sphere quickly formed over her horn, growing in size rapidly. He saw she quickly dashed backwards and took a strong stance. He charged his spirit power into his blades. Apache fired off a Sarah larger than she ever had before. Before the beam could reach him, he saw she unleashed 4 massive energy slashes that cut the Sarah apart, causing it to brush past him while he remained untouched between the split beams. Although he remained unaffected, the same couldn't be said about their surroundings, as her beams left giant gouges in the sand and even completely blew away the sand dunes in their path. Apache glared at him while breathing heavily. Why can't I win? She yelled. He saw she shrugged. You know what I'm fighting for. I can't afford to be weak. Do you want to keep trying? He asked. She hesitated for a while. No, she eventually managed to get out through gritted teeth. She didn't seem reconciled though. After a long sigh, she put away her Zanpakuto. I'm still going to beat you in the future, she said. The others had already noticed the duel had drawn to a rather one-sided end. 115 skulking rats. Harel nodded towards them. That was really good, she said. This seemed to cheer Apache up a little as her frown lightened. Mila Rose grinned. Now I kind of want to fight, she said. He saw she chuckled. Want one now? He asked. She shook her head somberly. No, I would stand even less of a chance than Apache did, she said. Apache glared at them both. Hey! She yelled out offendedly. You both did great. I thought things were only just starting to get interesting though. When were you going to bring out the whips and blindfolds? Sung-sun asked with a smirk. Shut the fuck up, Sung-sun. Apache shouted. Hisashi rolled his eyes. So is that what you do in your free time? He teased back. Sung-sun licked her lips seductively. Wouldn't you like to know? She said. Nellil wrapped her arms around him from behind and glared at Sung-sun. Hisashi watched her with a soft smile. That only made her laugh. Lighten up, sweetie. I'm just teasing him, she said. Nellil just kept staring at her though and refused to let go of Hisashi. Hisashi chuckled awkwardly. How about we get to heading back? He asked, trying to change the topic. Harel nodded. Does anyone need to do anything before? She asked. She just got a bunch of shrugs. There wasn't that much to do in Wo Mundo after all, and unlike Hisashi, the others weren't near as eager to hunt other hollow. Only Mila Rose had her moments. Los Noches. They saw the dome of Los Noches approaching from the horizon. Hisashi sensed a malicious gaze on them coming from ahead. He wasn't sure exactly who the target of the gaze was, but it was certainly someone amongst them. It disappeared before he could find out who it was from though. He shook his head. Whoever it is, it seems things are going to become busier soon, he thought. He wasn't too worried about himself. He could defend himself from most after all. However, the others were another story altogether, and it left him worried. Those that hadn't become Arrancar yet would struggle with any of the Espada, and Nellil's original Frakian wouldn't stand a chance against almost any Arrancar at all. He turned back to the others standing behind him. I have a feeling someone is going to make a move on us again. No matter what until specified otherwise, make sure to travel in groups wherever you go. It would be best if at least one amongst Nellil, Harel, Apache, and I are with you at all times. This goes double if you are heading outside of Los Noches, he said. Harel's gaze turned serious. She nodded in agreement. Out of everyone, she had been the only one to fear she might get eliminated after all. If Hisashi hadn't been there, she had no idea how things might have turned out instead. He looked over at Pest and Don Dakaka. This goes even more for the two of you. Make sure you are always accompanied by one of us, he said. They saluted exaggeratedly. Yes, sir. They shouted. Nellil smiled. Why do I have to do what you say? Apache asked. Hisashi gave her a glance. Do I need to spank you again? He asked. She subconsciously covered her behind. When she realized what she was doing, she just glared at him. Sung-sun slithered up beside him with a smirk. Whatever you say, hubby, she said. I'd like to see them try anything, Mila Rose said confidently. She smirked, looking at Hisashi. After watching your battle, I'm itching for some action. How about we take a mission together? She asked. Hisashi shrugged. That's fine by me, he said. She patted him on the shoulder a little harder than was appreciated. Great. Let's go pick one up right away, she said excitedly. Hisashi handled most of the talking as Mila Rose didn't have the patience to deal with these things. The Arrancar staffing the office gave him the information they had for a few missions they were eligible for. Any of them sound good to you? Hisashi asked Mila Rose. She shrugged. Whatever you choose, she said nonchalantly. He turned back to the staff and marked the job they would be taking. It didn't take them long to process the request. Thankfully, Los Noches was small enough that the little bit of bureaucracy there was still kept to an acceptable level. No ridiculous appointments and wait times. Mila Rose smiled. So can we go now? She asked. As soon as he nodded in agreement, she grabbed his arm and started dragging him out of the office. Moments after they exited, he once again felt the same malicious gaze he had noticed before. Is it Grimmjow? He wondered. He shook his head. Nah, he wouldn't be skulking around like a little rat, he thought. On their way to the palace to let them know what they would be doing and say goodbye, they ran into Suruxi. Hey. What a coincidence running into you here, she said with a heavy dose of fake positivity. While she was trying to ingratiate herself to Mila Rose, Hisashi gave her the side eye. Was it her? Did she give up on winning the girls over? He wondered. He wasn't entirely sure, but the timing was more than a little suspicious. He put on a fake smile. At least it was better than hers. Yes, such a happy coincidence. Great to see you again, Suruxi. So what brings you here? He asked. She looked at him with disdain. Yes. Hi, she said. Turning back to Mila Rose, she asked, "So what are you doing?" She asked. Hisashi sighed. "Sure, ignore my question," he thought exasperatedly. After Mila Rose explained what they were doing, Suruxi suspiciously volunteered herself to join them and said she had nothing better to do. This did nothing to alleviate his already growing suspicions, but he agreed nonetheless. He hoped he could draw out whatever their plans might be by putting themselves in a more vulnerable position. As far as they were concerned, after all, Mila Rose and him were just two regular hollow that hadn't even experienced a reincarnation yet. The types most of them looked down upon. 116 Korea Jin. Karakura Town, Karakura General Hospital, August 23rd afternoon. Ichigo burst into the room. "Ishida!" he yelled. Masaki frowned and grabbed him by the ear and pulled him aside. "Shh! He's injured," she said. "Ah! Mom!" Ichigo screamed in pain. Ishida was laying in a hospital bed wrapped in bandages. "It hurts my injuries, so next time, will you please enter more quietly?" he said. "You're all right?" Rukia asked. "Thank goodness," Inoue said. "What in the world happened?" Ichigo asked. Ishida said the female Bount told him when Bount suck the soul of a living person, they gain immense energy. So much that they would affect space itself, allowing them to travel to the afterworld. It would also undermine the balance of the world. It had been against the rules to do so, but a Bount who disagreed appeared, Jin Korea. Her goal was to defeat him and end his ambitions. Jin would come for Ishida because he was a Quincy. After that he lost consciousness and woke up in the hospital. Karakura Town, in front of Karakura General Hospital, night. Ichigo's group had been hunted throughout the hospital by two young male Bount who each possessed a water-based doll that could control all the water in the environment. They finally managed to escape the hospital to find it was raining outside. The two dolls appeared from the rain puddles in front of them and the two young male Bount revealed themselves. "Don't you think it's about time we get them banned?" one of the Bount said. "I think so, ho," the other replied. "Here we go." They shouted in tandem. Their dolls started absorbing the surrounding water to grow larger and even combined together to grow even larger once again. They were suddenly interrupted by the sound of clapping echoing. It took them all a few moments to realize it was coming from the roof of the hospital. There they saw two women standing side by side. One a mature woman with wavy brown hair and what appeared to be a bone-like white body armor that covered everything except her head. The other a young woman with long sleek black hair wearing a large pointy witch hat and flowing dress holding a silvery staff. Mom?" Ichigo stuttered in surprise. Masaki simply smiled. Raina seemed to disappear from the roof and suddenly reappeared in between the Bount and Ichigo's group less than a fraction of a second later. Ishida looked surprised. "Was that Hirankyaku?" he asked. Raina smirked and looked over at the two Bount. "You two brats have been acting quite arrogant," she said. That seemed to get on their nerves. Given that they were Bount despite looking like brats, they were probably over 100 years old. "Be brats," one of them said. They ordered the dolls to attack. Raina stretched her staff towards the fused attacking dolls. "Frost," she said. Suddenly a cold wave was sent out from the head of her staff. As it traveled forward, everything it touched rapidly froze, including the massive fused doll and all the water they were using. The two Bount glared at Raina. "No way. Ghoul. Gunther," they yelled. Before they could even free their dolls, two consecutive energy arrows pierced the brows of the Bount. When they followed the trajectory of the arrows, they found Masaki still standing on the roof with the energy bow extending from her wrist drawn. The Bount's bodies hadn't even fallen yet when they rapidly aged, desiccated and turned to dust, leaving only their clothing. Inoue screamed. What's this?" Chad asked. "What's going on?" Ichigo asked. "They've turned to dust," Renji said. "Even though they looked like children, they were probably past their limits as living beings," Rukia said. Masaki used Hirankyaku to appear beside Raina. "Nice job," she said. "Mom, wasn't that a little?" Ichigo tried to say. Masaki shook her head. "You still have to grow up, Ichigo-kun," she said. Karakura Town, Urahara Store, August 24th afternoon. Since they had blown up the entire hospital floor Ishida was staying in, they brought him to the Urahara Store to allow him to recover in safety. Rairin, Kurido, and Nobu had already switched back from their plush animal bodies to their human-like Gigai. Everyone was just lazing about when Rairin, Kurido, and Nobu suddenly froze. "They're here!" Rairin yelled. Ichigo jumped up. Where? He asked. The three mod souls seemed to be thinking for a moment. They seem to have us surrounded, Kurado said. Raina activated her bracelet, transforming it into her staff and summoning her witch hat and dress. Masaki transformed into her Nick-Tig form. Chad transformed his right arm into its black and red form. Rukia slaps Khan using a red fingerless glove, causing his pill-like true body to pop out of the stuffed lion's mouth and stuffed it into Ichigo's mouth to separate his soul from his body. Renji separated from his Gigai using a soul candy. Khan, take Renji's Gigai and hide in the basement with Ishida. Ichigo shouted. Khan and Ichigo's body dragged Renji's Gigai and jumped down the hole into the basement. Raina ran out of the store with everyone to find a group of 6 men and a woman surrounding the store. Most of them were smirking maliciously. They're all Bount, Ryren said. Ichigo, Chad, and Renji jumped in front of everyone. Meanwhile Rukia, Tessai, Yuru and Jinta stuck back to protect Inoue. Raina and Masaki stuck together, most used to fighting together. Urahara seemed to have mysteriously gone missing. The young-looking white-haired male Bount stepped forward. Hello, I'm Korea Jin. Why don't you hand over the Quincy? We aren't looking for anything else, he said. The middle-aged Bount with parted brown hair frowned. Korea, why are we wasting our time like this? He asked. Jin shook his head. Why fight if we don't have to, Ryo? He asked. Ryo's frown deepened. We won't be letting you take Ishida-kun, Ichigo said firmly. Jin sighed. Such a shame. In that case we'll just have to take him, he said. The Bounts summoned their dolls.